Hey guys and welcome back to my channel. This is part 1 of what if Naruto had Sukuna sealed inside him. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and also go and support the author, link in description. October 10th, the night of the attack. Deep underground, in a hidden chamber guarded by the finest Anbu of the Hidden Leaf, the air was thick with tension and chakra. Kushina Uzumaki lay on a specially reinforced table, her face and crimson hair slick with sweat as she fought to bring her child into the world. Beside her, Minato Namikaze, the fourth Hokage, stood with his fists clenched, his sharp eyes darting between his wife and the steadily pulsing seal on her abdomen. "Arg, it hurts, ya know," Kushina screamed, her voice echoing off the cold stone walls. The pain of childbirth was excruciating, but it was amplified tenfold by the relentless thrashing of the 9 tails within her, trying to break free. Minato's heart clenched as he watched her struggle. He had faced countless enemies, but seeing his wife in such pain made him feel helpless. "Is this really okay?" he asked, his gaze shifting nervously to Bawako Sarutobi, the wife of the third Hokage, who was overseeing the birth alongside her assistant, Taji. Bawako's calm demeanor belied the gravity of the situation. The third Hokage's wife, who was overseeing. "She's fine," Bawako replied sharply, not looking up as her hands moved with practiced precision. "Just keep your focus on the seal. The last thing we need is the 9 tails escaping." "But she..." "Minato." Bawako cut him off, her tone commanding. "You're the fourth Hokage. Most men wouldn't survive a fraction of the pain she's enduring right now. Women are much stronger. So get a grip." Minato nodded, swallowing his worry. She was right. This wasn't the time to falter. His role was clear, to maintain the seal on the 9 tails. Kushina let out another anguished cry, clutching the edges of the table. "The 9 tails, it's fighting harder, trying to get out." She gasped, her crimson hair splayed out around her like a fiery halo. "Hang in there, Kushina," Minato urged, his voice steady but his expression strained. "Naruto, please hurry." "Push, Kushina." Taji, Bawako's assistant, urged. "You're almost there." The 9 tails let out a deafening roar from within Kushina, its chakra flaring violently. Minato could feel the strain on the seal as the beast clawed for freedom, but he gritted his teeth, pouring his chakra into reinforcing the barrier. "The head's out," Bawako exclaimed. "Just a little more, Kushina. One final push." The 9 tails let out another ferocious roar, its malevolent chakra pressing against the seal. The air grew heavier, the tension almost unbearable. "Naruto, hurry up and come out," Minato shouted. "And you, stay in, 9 tails." With one last, desperate push, Kushina let out a scream that echoed with both pain and triumph. A new sound filled the room, a baby's cry, piercing and pure. Minato felt his heart swell with relief and joy. "He's here. Hot water, now," Bawako commanded, her voice steady despite the tension. Taji hurried to comply, handing her the basin. After cleaning the newborn, Bawako wrapped him in a soft orange blanket and placed him gently beside Kushina. Kushina's tired eyes filled with tears as she gazed at her son. "We finally meet, Naruto," she whispered, her voice trembling with love. Minato wiped his eyes, a proud smile lighting up his face. "I'm a father," he said softly, almost in disbelief. But his moment of joy was short-lived. "All right, Kushina," Minato said, his voice shifting to a serious tone. "It's rough, having just given birth, but we need to suppress the 9 tails completely again." Before Kushina could respond, 2 groans echoed through the chamber. Minato's eyes widened in alarm as he turned to see Bawako and Taji collapse to the ground, blood pooling around them. Standing behind them was a man cloaked in black, his face obscured by a mask with a single, cold eye peering through, held Naruto in one arm. In his other hand, a kunai. "Lady Bawako." "Taji," he called out, but there was no response. Minato's blood ran cold. He hadn't sensed the man's presence, hadn't even heard him approach. The masked man's aura was chilling, a void that swallowed all light and warmth. "Fourth Hokage," the man said, his voice calm and unnervingly composed. "Step away from the Jinchuriki, or this child dies." Minato's mind raced. His son, his newborn child, was in the hands of a man who had bypassed their strongest Anbu guards without raising an alarm. Who was this man? His movements were precise, his presence undetectable, a clear sign of an elite shinobi, possibly beyond even Anbu level. How had he infiltrated the most secure place in the village? And most importantly, how could Minato save both his family and his village? The masked man's kunai pressed closer to Naruto's neck. I won't repeat myself, Minato Namikaze. Step away, or you'll lose your son before he's even taken his first breath. Minato clenched his fists, his sharp mind calculating the odds. His wife was vulnerable, the nine-tailed seal unstable, and his son's life hung in the balance. But his resolve didn't waver. He would not let this masked man dictate the fate of his family. Who are you? Minato demanded, his voice cold as steel. That's irrelevant, the masked man replied, his tone laced with mockery. What matters is that tonight, you will lose everything, your family, your village, your life. The kunai hovered dangerously close to Naruto's neck, its gleaming edge reflecting the dim light of the underground chamber. Minato's heart pounded, his mind racing as he stared down the masked man. He forced himself to keep his composure, though every fiber of his being screamed to act. Whoa, calm down, Minato said, his voice measured and calm, masking the turmoil inside. There's no need to do this. He hoped that he could de-escalate the situation, but deep down, he knew it was a slim chance. This man wasn't here to talk. The masked man tilted his head slightly, his visible eye cold and calculating. Speak for yourself, he said, his tone almost amused. I'm supremely calm, Minato Namikaze. Before Minato could respond, the masked man tossed Naruto into the air with a casual flick of his wrist. The baby's small form rose, gravity already pulling him back toward the awaiting kunai in the man's other hand, poised to strike. Naruto. Kushina's scream tore through the chamber, raw with fear and desperation. Minato's mind snapped into action. Time seemed to slow as he called upon every ounce of his legendary speed. In an instant, he vanished, the sharp crack of the body flicker jutsu resonating through the air, his natural speed augmenting his movements. His arms reached out, catching Naruto mere moments before the kunai could pierce the child's delicate skin. The masked man chuckled darkly. Leave it to the yellow flash, he said mockingly, his tone dripping with sarcasm. But now, what will you do next? Minato's sharp blue eyes narrowed as he cradled Naruto. Something felt off. The way the masked man had moved, the way he had tossed Naruto, it wasn't reckless. It was calculated. Minato's eyes darted to the orange blanket Naruto was wrapped in, and his heart sank. His sharp gaze spotted them immediately, paper bombs. A trap, Minato realized, his mind reeling. The masked man had planned this all along. Without wasting a second, Minato began ripping the tags from the blanket, his fingers moving with surgical precision. The faint hiss of the ignited seals was growing louder, and he knew he didn't have much time. With a flash, Minato activated his flying Raijin jutsu, teleporting himself and Naruto to the closest marked location, a shed just outside the main compound. The moment they arrived, he flung the blanket away, the paper bombs still sizzling. The explosion that followed was deafening. A fiery wave of destruction engulfed the shed, sending Minato and Naruto hurtling through the air. Minato twisted mid-flight, shielding Naruto with his body. The searing heat licked at his back, and sharp splinters of wood rained down like shrapnel. When they hit the ground, Minato grunted in pain, feeling a sharp sting in his leg. He glanced down and saw a long wooden splinter embedded in his thigh, blood already seeping through his pants. But he ignored the pain, his focus entirely on the baby in his arms. Naruto, he whispered, relief washing over him as he saw that his son was unharmed. Before he could catch his breath, realization dawned on him. The teleportation hadn't just saved Naruto, it had separated him from Kushina. That bastard, Minato said, his voice low and furious. He forced me to use the flying Raijin, to isolate me from Kushina. The masked man had anticipated Minato's every move, orchestrating the situation to perfection. Minato's jaw clenched as he stood, pulling the splinter out his leg. He knew he had to act fast. The masked man wasn't done yet, this was only the beginning. I gotta hurry and get to Kushina. Minato then teleported to his and Kushina house. You'll be safe here, please be patient Naruto. I need to rescue your mother, he said while tucking Naruto in the crib already prepared for him. Meanwhile with the masked man. He had Kushina bound by a ceiling. Kushina lay bound by the ceiling jutsu, her body trembling with exhaustion. She had just endured the unimaginable pain of childbirth while suppressing the Nine Tails' relentless thrashing inside her. Now, drained and weakened, she could do nothing as the masked man's shadow loomed over her. Her crimson hair clung to her damp face as she glared up at him with tired but defiant eyes. What do you want? She demanded, her voice strained, her breathing shallow. The masked man tilted his head slightly, his voice eerily calm as he replied, I'm going to extract the Nine Tails from you, and then crush Konoha. Kushina's tired eyes snapped open in shock, her body tensing despite its weakness. What? She gasped. You can't. The masked man chuckled, his tone casual, as if they were discussing the weather. Oh, but I can. And I shall. There is nothing you can do to stop me, Kushina Uzumaki. He stepped closer, his single visible eye gleaming as he examined the seal on her abdomen. His fingers hovered just above it, and he let out a low, amused laugh. I see that Minato incorporated his teleportation jutsu into the seal holding the Nine Tails. Impressive. It seems the fourth Hokage thinks of everything. He paused, his voice turning mocking. Unfortunately for you, he isn't here. That seal which holds the Nine Tails is weakened by childbirth, and Minato is far too preoccupied to save you now. Do you have any idea how long I've waited for this day? Kushina's heart pounded as fear gripped her. She struggled against the bindings, but her body refused to obey her. She could only watch as the masked man turned his attention to the Nine Tails. The masked man's Sharingan glowed ominously, spinning rapidly as he directed its power at the beast within Kushina. The Nine Tails growled, its massive form coiling within the seal as it tried to resist. Its malevolent chakra flared wildly, shaking the very ground beneath them. You will submit, the masked man said coldly. The Nine Tails roared in defiance, its massive tails thrashing as it fought the genjutsu. But the masked man's Sharingan was relentless. Slowly, the Nine Tails' resistance faltered. Its movements slowed, its roars dulled, and finally, its crimson eyes reflected the spiraling tomo of the masked man's Sharingan in proof of the Nine Tails' submission. No, Kushina whispered, tears streaming down her face. She could feel the Nine Tails being subdued, its chakra seeping through the cracks in the weakened seal. Her body convulsed as the immense energy tore through her, the pain unlike anything she had ever experienced. The masked man smirked. Now, come forth, Nine Tails. With a final roar, the Nine Tails broke free of the seal. Its colossal chakra exploded outward, flooding the chamber in a wave of malevolent energy. The beast began to materialize, its massive body towering over the lake and the surrounding stone pillars. The Nine Tails roared again, shaking the earth and sky as it fully manifested. Its crimson eyes were shaped like a Sharingan, now under the control of the masked man's Sharingan, gleamed with hatred and fury. Kushina's body crumpled forward, hitting the cold stone with a dull thud. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, her chakra utterly depleted. She looked up weakly, her vision blurring as the masked man's shadow loomed over her once more. The Nine Tails turned its attention to Kushina, its massive claws raised as if to crush her. Its rage was palpable, the years of confinement boiling over into a single, murderous intent. Kushina. The masked man mocked, his tone almost gleeful, as if savoring her suffering. Even the beast you kept imprisoned for so long despises you. The Nine Tails' massive claw descended, the air itself trembling with the sheer force of the blow. It was a crushing moment, one that would surely obliterate her. But before the claw could strike, Minato appeared in a flash, his figure materializing between the beast and Kushina. He grabbed her, teleporting them high above the battlefield with the flying Raijin jutsu, his movements swift and decisive. The masked man's single visible eye narrowed as he turned to face Minato. So, you've arrived, fourth Hokage, he said, his voice calm, almost too calm for the situation. You really are a flash, but you're too late. Minato didn't even spare him a glance as he focused on his wife, his heart pounding with worry and rage. He looked down at Kushina, her body weak, but her eyes still filled with the fire that he had always loved. Minato, she whispered, her voice barely audible, but still holding the strength that had carried them both through so much. Is Naruto all right? Minato's gaze softened, his hand gently brushing her cheek. Yeah, Naruto's fine. He's in a safe place. Kushina's lips parted in relief, a weak but grateful smile tugging at her lips. Oh, that's good. But despite her relief, Minato could feel the reality of their situation. The toll this had taken on her was clear. If she weren't an Uzumaki, if she hadn't been as strong as she was, she'd be dead already. Minato's eyes hardened as he turned his gaze back to the masked man, his hands curling into fists. The rage that burned within him was something he had never felt before. This was beyond anger. This was the kind of fury that could tear the world apart. His teeth ground together, the force of his frustration pushing him to the brink. Kushina, still aware of the weight of the situation, felt his anger radiating off him. She reached out weakly, her hand trembling as it touched his arm. Minato, she said softly. You have to stop him, that man, and the Nine Tails, they're planning to destroy Konoha. Minato said nothing, only looking down at her, his heart heavy with the knowledge that he was about to make a choice, one that could change everything. After a long moment, he nodded silently. Without another word, Minato teleported them back to their home. Minato laid Kushina gently on the bed beside Naruto's crib. Her breathing was shallow, her body trembling with exhaustion, but her eyes softened as she looked at their son. Her hand weakly reached out, brushing against Naruto's tiny fingers. Minato, she whispered, her voice faint but filled with emotion. I'm glad, we got to see him. Minato stood silently for a moment, his gaze lingering on her. Then, without a word, he turned his back to her, reaching for his Hokage cloak. As he slipped it over his shoulders and secured it, his voice broke the silence, firm yet gentle. I'll be right back, he said, his back still to her. Kushina watched him, her heart heavy but filled with trust. She smiled faintly, her lips trembling as she whispered, be careful. Minato glanced over his shoulder one last time, his face unreadable but his resolve clear. Then, in a flash of yellow light, he was gone, leaving their home quiet and still, except for the soft breathing of Kushina and Naruto. The Nine Tails rampage. The Nine Tails' roar reverberated through the village, shaking the very ground beneath it. Its massive tails swung like wrecking balls, obliterating buildings and sending shockwaves rippling through the streets. Fires burned uncontrollably, and the once bustling Hidden Leaf village was reduced to chaos and destruction. The beast crouched low, its crimson eyes gleaming with malevolent intent. Chakra began to swirl violently in its mouth, forming a massive sphere of energy, the beginnings of a tailed beast bomb. The glow intensified, and the sheer pressure of the attack pressed down on the surrounding area, forcing even the bravest shinobi to falter. Sarutobi, the third Hokage, stood amidst his men, gripping his staff tightly. Brace yourselves, he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Do not falter. Protect the village at all costs. As the Nine Tails prepared to unleash the devastating attack, a massive shadow suddenly loomed over the battlefield. In a flash of yellow light, Minato Namikaze appeared above the beast, and he summoned Gamabunta, the Toad Boss, dropping it in the Nine Tails. Hold it down, Minato commanded, his voice steady and resolute. Gamabunta grunted, his massive limbs slamming down to pin the Nine Tails. Easier said than done, kid. The toad bellowed, struggling to keep the beast's thrashing tails under control. The Nine Tails roared in fury, its crimson eyes narrowing as it focused on Minato. The tailed beast bomb in its mouth continued to grow, its energy crackling with deadly intent. Minato didn't hesitate. In a single fluid motion, he placed a flying raging seal on the Nine Tails' massive form. He vanished in a blur of yellow light, taking the beast and the fully charged tailed beast bomb with him. The battlefield fell silent for a brief moment, the oppressive weight of the Nine Tails chakra suddenly gone. Shinobi and civilians alike stared in stunned disbelief, their breaths caught in their throats. Far outside the village, the Nine Tails reappeared, the tailed beast bomb detonated with a deafening explosion, the resulting shockwave flattening the surrounding forest. The Nine Tails roared in pain as it took the brunt of its own attack, its massive body crashing to the ground. Minato reappeared a safe distance away, his Hokage cloak fluttering in the wind as he landed gracefully. He had timed his escape perfectly, avoiding the blast by mere seconds. Minato leaned against a tree, trying to catch his breath. His breaths came in sharp, uneven gasps. The teleportation and constant use of the flying Raijin had drained most of his chakra. The Nine Tails, though wounded from its own tailed beast bomb, began to stir, its malevolent chakra flaring once more. There wasn't much time. With a flash of yellow light, Minato reappeared inside the forest, cradling both Kushina and Naruto in his arms. Kushina, pale and trembling, looked up at him with weary eyes. Minato, you've done enough. You don't have the chakra left too. I know, Minato cut her off gently, his expression resolute but tinged with sorrow. But we can't let the Nine Tails rampage any further. The village, Naruto's future, depends on us stopping it here. Kushina's eyes flickered toward Naruto, who lay nestled in her arms, his soft cries a painful reminder of the innocents caught in this cruel storm. She felt the weight of Minato's words, but the thought of condemning their son to a life as a Jinchuriki filled her heart with anguish. The Nine Tails roared in the distance, its massive body thrashing as it began to rise. Minato's gaze hardened, and he turned back to Kushina. You're the only one who can hold it now, Kushina. I need your chakra chains to restrain it and form a barrier. Kushina hesitated for a moment, then nodded weakly. Summoning the last reserves of her strength, she planted Naruto on the ground beside her, her hands forming seals. Brilliant golden chakra chains erupted from her body, snaking through the air with incredible speed. They wrapped tightly around the Nine Tails, binding its limbs and tails before forming a glowing dome-like barrier around the beast. The Nine Tails howled in rage, its crimson eyes blazing as it struggled against the restraints. But Kushina's chains held firm, the barrier shimmering with an ethereal light. Kushina slumped to her knees, her body trembling from the effort of maintaining the chains. Minato knelt beside her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. She turned to him, her tired eyes filled with pain. Minato, she whispered, her voice breaking. I don't want this. I know what it means to carry this burden. I don't want that for Naruto. I don't want him to grow up hated and feared, like I was. Minato's hand tightened slightly on her shoulder. He understood her pain more than anyone. Kushina, he said softly, I don't want this for him either. But if we don't do this, there won't be a future for him, or for anyone. Tears welled up in Kushina's eyes as she looked down at Naruto. He was so small, so fragile. The thought of placing such a heavy burden on him tore her apart. Minato, he's just a baby. Minato reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. His eyes, usually so calm and reassuring, were heavy with sorrow. He is, he admitted. But he's our son, and if there's anyone who can bear this, it's him. We have to believe in him, Kushina. We have to trust that he'll grow stronger than either of us could ever imagine. Kushina's lips trembled, and she looked back at Naruto, her tears falling silently. The world rides on this, doesn't it? She asked, her voice barely audible. Minato nodded. It does. But more than that, our son's future depends on it. We're not condemning him, Kushina. We're giving him a chance to save the world, to be the hero he was born to be. This is what Jiraiya sensei was talking about it. For a moment, Kushina said nothing. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, she nodded, her resolve hardening. She tightened her grip on the chains, fortifying the barrier as Minato began preparing for the sealing. The golden glow of her chakra chains burned brightly against the encroaching darkness, holding the raging Nine Tails firmly in place. Minato closed his eyes briefly, steeling himself for what was to come. When he opened them again, they were filled with unshakable resolve. His hands moved swiftly, forming the hand seals needed to summon the Shinigami. The air grew cold, an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into the very bones of the earth. A ghostly wind swept through the clearing, and the spectral form of the Reaper materialized behind Minato. Its hollow eyes stared ahead, emotionless and eternal, its blade glinting faintly in the dim light. The Nine Tails recoiled, its crimson eyes narrowing as it growled deeply. You dare summon that thing, it spat, its voice laced with both fury and unease. Minato ignored the beast, his focus entirely on the Shinigami. Take half of the Nine Tails chakra into me, he commanded, his voice steady and firm. The Reaper's hand extended toward Minato, its ghostly fingers piercing his chest without resistance. Pain shot through him, sharp and cold, but he remained still, unwavering. As the Reaper's other hand plunged into the Nine Tails, something unexpected stirred within the beast's chakra. It was faint at first, a ripple, but it grew stronger, darker, coiling like a shadow within the Nine-Tails' immense power. The Nine-Tails' eyes flared crimson as it let out a deafening roar, its instinct sensing its impending doom. Its massive claws thrashed violently against the barrier, the chains groaning under the strain. Then, with a burst of raw hatred, one of its claws broke free, aiming directly at the infant, Naruto, who lay crying in a basket on the ground. Time seemed to freeze. Minato's body moved instantly, placing himself between the claw and his son. The Nine-Tails' massive claw pierced straight through his chest, and Kushina's as she threw herself forward to shield both Minato and Naruto. Blood sprayed into the air as the force of the attack drove both of them backward, but Minato managed to stay on his feet, his body trembling from the impact. Kushina gasped, her face contorted in pain, but she remained steady, her chains surging to restrain the beast once more. "Kushina, you didn't have to," Minato began, his voice weak. "I'm his mother," she interrupted, her voice trembling but firm. "I'll protect him, no matter what." Minato's expression tightened, his resolve hardening despite the searing pain coursing through him. He turned back to the Reaper, his focus unshaken. The spectral hand continued its work, ripping half of the Nine-Tails chakra from its massive form and dragging it toward Minato. The beast howled in fury, its body shrinking slightly as its power was siphoned away. Minato staggered, the immense chakra settling within him. His body shook under the strain, but he continued the sealing process. Blood dripped from his wounds, pooling on the ground as he looked toward Naruto, still crying in the basket. "Now, the rest," Minato said, his voice barely audible. The Reaper moved again, its spectral hand plunging into the Nine-Tails once more, directing the remaining chakra into Naruto. But as the sealing neared completion, that dark presence, the shadow that had stirred within the beast's power, coiled silently into the seal alongside the Nine-Tails. It slipped through, unnoticed by all but the faintest of Minato's senses. What was that? He thought, unease forming briefly in his mind. But there was no time to question it. The Shinigami's blade glinted faintly as the ritual reached its conclusion. With a final, chilling motion, the Reaper claimed its payment. Minato's body trembled as the Reaper's cold fingers grasped his soul, pulling it free. He collapsed to the ground, his breathing shallow, the life fading from his eyes. Beside him, Kushina fell to her knees, the blood loss and strain finally overwhelming her. She turned her gaze to Naruto one last time, her lips trembling as she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Naruto, live, for both of us." With that, her body slumped, lifeless, next to Minato's. In the silence that followed, the faint glow of the seal on Naruto's stomach shimmered, the dark presence within it settling into the depths of his soul, a silent force, waiting for its moment to awaken. 8 years later, Konoha. It's been 8 years since the Nine-Tails attack. The village managed to rebuild itself, but many things were lost that could not be regained. Many shinobi and civilian lives were lost as well, husbands, wives, children, becoming paralyzed, or losing a limb. Nearly everyone lost something or rather someone. The biggest hit to the village was the death of the fourth Hokage and his wife. The fourth Hokage sacrificed his life to seal the nine-tailed fox away, or rather that's how it was told, but in reality half of the beast was sealed in a young boy, named Naruto Uzumaki. Naruto had just been born when the nine-tailed fox was sealed within him, a secret kept from the young boy. Though the general public was unaware of this, most of the adults in the village knew the truth. Unfortunately, Naruto suffered greatly due to this, facing mistreatment, starvation, and ostracization from the villagers. And that wasn't all. Fate had already been cruel to Naruto by snatching away his parents, whom he had never known, leaving him an orphan and knowing nothing of them, not even their deaths. So being an orphan, he had once lived at the orphanage, but that had ended abruptly when he turned 4. The matron had shoved him out the door without explanation, her muttered words about curses and bad omens the only clues to her reasoning. He had wandered aimlessly after that, cold and confused, until an Anbu with a dog mask found him shivering in the streets. The next day, the Hokage had taken him in, giving him a small apartment and enough money to survive. The old man had been kind, and Naruto appreciated it, but it couldn't fill the void in Naruto's heart. He often saw parents with their children, or siblings together, but Naruto had none of that. no family, legacy, or inheritance. He didn't even have relatives or kinfolk. He was just an orphan, with no family, no answers, and no one to call. Tu-chan, dad, or Ka-chan, mom, no one to call him son. The words felt strange to Naruto, and he sometimes said them to himself alone. He knew what it meant, knew that families called each other that, but he couldn't imagine what it felt like to hear some say it to him and mean it. Often the Hokage stopped by his apartment every month to check on him and give him his spend tip for the month, just enough to cover rent and a few other necessities, but even those came at a steep price. Shopkeepers and vendors would often overcharge him for basic necessities, food, clothing, even soap. A loaf of bread that cost anyone else a few coins was double, even triple the price for Naruto. Even stale bread seemed too expensive at times. Fresh fruit or vegetables were entirely out of reach. He quickly learned not to argue, as protests only earned him more scorn and, sometimes, a shopkeeper throwing him out entirely. Because of this, Naruto relied on instant ramen to keep his stomach full. But there was one place that didn't make him feel like an outsider, Ichiraku Ramen. And when the Hokage did stop by, Naruto tried to ask about his parents many times. Who were they? Naruto would ask, his voice small but hopeful, as though the answer might somehow explain everything. They gave their lives for the village, the Hokage always replied, his tone kind but distant. It was a comforting lie, the kind of lie meant to protect someone too young to handle the truth. But Naruto wasn't stupid like many believed him to be. He saw the way the old man's gaze shifted, how his answers never went deeper than those vague words. And Naruto could feel it, the weight of something unsaid, something the Hokage didn't want him to know. So he often pressed the old man, but as usual got nowhere. The loneliness hurt more than any words or glares could. He had learned to survive it, to pretend it didn't bother him, but some nights, when the village was quiet and there was no one to see him, he would sit by the window of his tiny apartment, staring at the moon, and wonder. Because of this, Naruto often pulled pranks and did other things just to get attention, even if it made them upset. Getting some attention was better than none at all. Naruto's pranks were his way of coping with the pain of loneliness, a way to force people to see him, even if it was through angry glares and shouted reprimands. He knew it wasn't the right kind of attention, knew it only made the villagers hate him more, but it was better than being invisible. When he painted the Hokage monument or dyed the water in the village fountains bright orange, for a brief moment, he wasn't just that kid the villagers avoided. He was Naruto Uzumaki, the prankster who had everyone talking. For a few fleeting seconds, they couldn't ignore him. Still, those moments didn't last. Once the mess was cleaned up and the scolding was over, the silence crept back in, heavier than before. Sitting alone in his tiny apartment, staring out at the village that seemed to loathe him, Naruto would feel the weight of it settle in his chest again. Why does it have to be like this? He often wondered. Even when the Hokage visited, offering his gentle smile and kind words, it wasn't enough to fill the aching void. Naruto appreciated the old man's efforts, but it wasn't the same. It couldn't be. What he wanted wasn't the Hokage's pity or kindness, it was answers. It was a family. It was someone to look at him and call him son. But Naruto had learned to live without those things. He had no choice. So, he put on his biggest smile, laughed the loudest, and acted as if nothing could touch him. Because in a world that hated him, the only thing worse than being despised was being forgotten. Currently, Naruto was walking through the streets of the village with his hands tucked into his pockets. He had just finished a delicious bowl of ramen at Ichiraku's, the warm broth and noodles filling his stomach in a way that made the world feel a little less heavy, at least for a while. But as he walked, the familiar weight of the villagers' stares pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating like a shroud. He didn't need to meet their eyes to know what kind of looks they were giving him. He could feel them, sharp and unrelenting, boring into his back like daggers, each glance a silent condemnation. Hatred, disdain, disgust, expressions that had shadowed him since he was old enough to notice them. If looks could kill, he would have died 1,000 times over by now. Their gazes carried no warmth, only cold, unyielding judgment, as if his mere existence were some unforgivable crime. He despised it, the way they stripped away any shred of his humanity with every glare, reducing him to a single, damning label. A monster. A mistake. Still, Naruto forced himself to keep moving, his lips stretching into a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. It was the same grin he'd practiced for years, a mask carefully crafted to shield the pain gnawing at his chest. He wore it like armor, hoping it would deflect the sharp edges of their words and the weight of their glares. But the villagers didn't seem to care. If anything, his defiance only seemed to provoke them further, as if his smile mocked them. Demon brat, someone muttered, the words slicing through the air like the edge of a kunai. Misfit, another spat, their voice laced with venom. Bastard, a man growled. I can't believe the Hokage still lets that thing live here, let alone walk around, an older villager sneered, their tone dripping with disgust. Yeah, if I was him I'd gotten rid of the thing a long time ago. Another villager agreed. Naruto's grin faltered for a fraction of a second, just long enough for the cracks to show, before he forced it back into place. He had heard these words for as long as he could remember, but their sting never dulled. Each word was a fresh wound, another reminder of his isolation. What had he done to deserve this? What could a small child have possibly done to make an entire village hate him so much? The adults glared at him with cold disdain, and the other kids avoided him at best, or, worse, joined in their parents' mocking cruelty. Whenever he had summoned the courage to ask why, the answers had always been the same, sharp, angry, and laced with bitterness. Sometimes, the words came with a shove or a kick for good measure. You know damn well what you did, you damn monster. If it wasn't for you, my wife and daughter would still be alive. You exist, that's what's wrong. Naruto had heard it all, over and over again, but the words never made sense. They only deepened his confusion. What could they possibly mean? He didn't understand how he could be responsible for their pain. He'd been just a baby when their hatred had begun. He didn't know who his parents were, didn't know if they'd done something so terrible that it had earned him this punishment by association. He didn't know why he had been left alone to bear the brunt of the village's scorn. All he knew was that no matter how much he smiled, no matter how many jokes he cracked or pranks he pulled, nothing ever changed. Their hatred remained, cold and unyielding, a wall he couldn't break through. He once asked the Hokage directly, his voice small but heavy with the weight of years of confusion and pain. It was late one evening after another day of whispered insults and cold glares, and the old man had come by to check on him as usual. Naruto had stared down at his hands, clenched into small fists on the table, before finally finding the courage to speak. Old man, he said quietly, his voice trembling. Why do the villagers hate me? What did I do to them? Hiruzen's hand paused mid-reach for his pipe, his expression tightening for a moment before he quickly masked it with a kind smile. He placed the pipe down, folding his hands neatly in front of him as he looked at the young boy. The weight of Naruto's question lingered in the air, pressing down on both of them. People fear what they don't understand, Naruto, the Hokage said gently, his tone filled with an almost paternal sadness. Sometimes, that fear turns into anger, and that anger becomes hatred. But I didn't do anything. Naruto blurted out, his voice rising with frustration. His fists pounded lightly against the table. I don't understand, what don't they understand about me? I'm just me. Hiruzen's eyes softened, but there was a flicker of something else in his gaze, something guarded. He reached across the table and placed a hand on Naruto's, stilling his movements. You must have faith, he said softly. One day, the people of this village will see you for who you really are, Naruto. They will see your strength, your kindness, and they will respect you. You just have to be patient. Naruto looked up at him, searching the old man's face for answers he knew he wouldn't find. Faith, patience, respect. Those were nice ideas, but they felt so far away, like a dream that wasn't meant for him. Do you really think that'll happen? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Hiruzen smiled, his hand giving Naruto's hand a reassuring squeeze. I do. You are destined for great things, Naruto. I believe in you. Naruto nodded slowly, forcing himself to smile in return. But as the Hokage excused himself and left for the night, the question still lingered in his mind, unanswered. If people feared what they didn't understand, then why didn't anyone try to understand him? Why did they look at him like he wasn't even human? And how was he supposed to have faith when he didn't even know what he was waiting for? Faith. It was a nice idea, but Faith couldn't quiet the whispers, stop the glares, or fill the emptiness that lingered in his chest. It didn't change the fact that he had to hunt for his own food some nights or eat cheap instant ramen because it was all he could afford. He'd spend hours in the woods hunting small animals. Rabbits and squirrels, and sometimes he'd fish in the streams outside the village. His catches were far from perfect, stringy meat, tough skins, and bony fish, but it was better than starving. Still, it was exhausting, and he often wished he didn't have to rely on the woods to keep himself fed. Most nights, all he had to eat was instant ramen, cheap and easy to make but hardly enough to keep him full. Still, ramen was better than nothing, and it was all he could afford. The stares and whispers followed him as he walked, but Naruto didn't stop. He wouldn't let them see how much it hurt. The grin stayed plastered to his face, and he kept his head high, even as his chest ached with the weight of their hatred. He had learned long ago that showing weakness only made things worse. So, he kept walking, ignoring the voices that tried to drag him down. Thankfully, there was one place in the entire village where Naruto didn't feel the weight of scorn: Ichiraku Ramen. Chuki, the owner, and his daughter, Ayame, were the only people who treated him with genuine kindness. Chuki never overcharged Naruto for a bowl of ramen, and their prices were already fair compared to the rest of the village. Sometimes, when Naruto looked especially thin or hadn't eaten in a while, Chuki would give him a bowl for free. "You're growing, kid. You need to eat," Chuki would say, ruffling Naruto's red and golden-tipped hair with a fatherly grin. Ayame would nod in agreement, sliding him an extra portion of pork or sneaking an egg into his bowl when her father wasn't looking. Ichiraku Ramen wasn't just food to Naruto, it was a rare sanctuary, a place where he could eat without fear of judgment or scorn. Chuki had been the first person in the village to truly see him as Naruto Uzumaki, not that thing, or the demon brat. For Naruto, that small act of acknowledgement meant the world. It wasn't just about the ramen, it was about being treated like a human being, like he mattered to someone. For that, Naruto would always be grateful. Now, as he walked through the streets with his hands tucked into his pockets, the warm broth and noodles still lingering in his belly, he thought about how much worse things would be without Chuki and Ayame. The thought gave him a flicker of warmth, a fleeting moment of solace. But even that warmth couldn't shield him from the weight of the villagers, glares or the whispers that followed him everywhere he went. Naruto sighed softly, his grin faltering for just a moment before he forced it back into place. His steps slowed as a strange chill ran down his spine, a sudden, inexplicable feeling that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Meanwhile, deep inside of him, an unexpected presence had awakened. Inside the seal. Deep within the confines of the seal, an oppressive and malevolent presence stirred in the endless void. The nine-tailed fox lay coiled within its cage, its massive form illuminated faintly by the eerie glow of the seal's intricate design. The cage itself was colossal, large enough to keep the nine tails contained. The oppressive energy of the space was suffocating, pressing down on everything within it, a constant reminder of the beast's imprisonment. The fox's massive head rested on its front paws, its crimson eyes glowing faintly in the shadows. Its 9 long, fiery tails swayed behind it, each moving with a life of its own, brushing lazily against the bars with a soft, rhythmic hum. For years, the beast had remained dormant, conserving its energy, the oppressive seal keeping its immense power in check. Its slow, deliberate breaths filled the silence, occasionally broken by the faint scrape of claws against the floor. Yet even in its slumber, the beast's aura radiated a cold, predatory malice, a force that seemed ready to burst forth the moment the chains weakened. But today, something had changed. One of the fox's crimson eyes snapped wide open, the glow piercing the void like a blade. Its ears twitched, picking up a faint disturbance in the oppressive silence, a shift that seemed almost as if the seal itself were responding to the sudden tension. The beast growled low, a sound that reverberated through the space like distant thunder. "What is this?" the fox rumbled, its voice guttural and sharp, carrying both curiosity and irritation. It lifted its head slightly, as its eyes scanned the void outside the cage. The oppressive air thickened further, as if the cage itself was reacting to the fox's heightened awareness. It wasn't the boy's usual turmoil of emotions that had caught its attention. Those faint echoes, confusion, pain, loneliness, were always there, pulsing weakly through the seal like a heartbeat. No, this was different. There was another presence, a faint, ominous energy, lingering just beyond the edge of perception. The air around it felt colder, darker, carrying a weight that was both unfamiliar and hauntingly familiar. The fox's gaze sharpened, its slitted pupil narrowing as it tried to pinpoint the source of the disturbance. Its tails flicked sharply, the motion sending a gust of oppressive energy rippling through the void. It bared its sharp teeth in a slow, deliberate snarl, its lips curling back in both irritation and intrigue. This presence, the fox muttered, its voice lower now, almost contemplative. Familiar, yet not. A shadow from the past, perhaps, or something far worse. Its claws scraped against the floor as it leaned closer to the bars. The presence wasn't fully there, more like an echo, faint and distant, but it was enough to disturb the beast's rest. It hated being caught off guard, especially in this confined state. "Whatever you are," it growled, "you'd better not interfere with what's mine." FYI, major spoiler for those who haven't read the end of the Jujutsu Kaisen manga. Elsewhere. Far within another part of the seal, he awakened, a man once feared by all and worshipped by some as a god. In his prime, he crushed the strongest of his era, rising to unparalleled heights. Yet even he, the king of curses, met his end in battle, defeated not by betrayal, but by the combined strength of those who came after him. Now, Ryomen Sukuna, the king of curses, awakened once more. "Where am I?" Sukuna muttered, his crimson eyes scanning his surroundings. The space around him stretched endlessly, dim and suffocating. Shallow water rippled beneath his feet, reflecting faint, warped patterns on the damp walls. Shadows clung to every surface, broken only by the occasional glimmer of distorted light. The air was heavy, stale, and devoid of life, pressing down like an unseen weight. "A sewer," he said, his tone calm, almost dismissive. The last thing he remembered doing was walking alongside Uraum after his brief exchange with that brat Mahito after dying. The memory was fragmented but clear enough. The afterlife. Rebirth. He mused, his voice low as the words hung in the stagnant air. If so, perhaps this is a strange path to either. And where is Uraum? After standing there for a moment, Sukuna began walking. Standing idle wouldn't give him the answers he sought, and he wasn't one to indulge in pointless waiting. His footsteps echoed softly in the stillness, each splash of water rippling outward in the silence. The sewer-like environment felt unnaturally quiet, not just devoid of sound but of something far more fundamental. He noticed it quickly, stopping mid-stride as his eyes narrowed. The realization crept in like a slow chill. The air itself was dead, empty of the energy he had always known. "There's no cursed energy here," he murmured, his voice quiet but deliberate. He extended his senses reflexively, searching his surroundings more. Then he checked himself, searching for the familiar immense power that had defined his existence for centuries. His gaze hardened as the truth became clear. "Not just here, but in me. I don't even feel my own." There was none. No cursed energy flowed within him, not even the faintest trace. It was a void he hadn't experienced in lifetimes, a complete absence of the power that had made him feared as a god to some and a demon to others among men. Sukuna's expression didn't shift, but the faintest flicker of intrigue danced behind his eyes. "Tch," he muttered softly. "No cursed energy. No techniques. Which means I'm left with only my wits and physical strength," he said out loud, but more to himself as he analyzed his current situation. How amusing. Despite being stripped of his arsenal, Sukuna couldn't help but feel intrigued, excited even. He resumed walking, his pace deliberate as his mind worked through the possibilities. The silence seemed to press heavier with every step, but Sukuna remained unfazed. "For all I know, this could very well be a death trap," he said aloud, his voice calm and measured. "Though if it is, whoever set it clearly doesn't understand what they've invited." His smirk deepened slightly, though his gaze remained sharp. "A pity. No matter, it's not like I haven't danced with death before, and having entered its domain once, well." The oppressive stillness of the corridor stretched on, the faint sound of water dripping in the distance, the only break in the silence. Yet, Sukuna moved without hesitation. His crimson eyes darted across the shadows, cataloging every detail with precision. As he moved deeper into this strange space, he began to notice the details, details that only served to reinforce how unnatural it all felt. The walls, if they could even be called that, were an oppressive, sickly shade of yellow. The color seemed to radiate faintly, casting an eerie glow that illuminated the corridor just enough to reveal its twists and turns. The yellow wasn't bright or warm, it was dull, almost sickening, as if the place itself had been stained by something long ago. Sukuna's eyes traced the uneven texture of the walls, noting the streaks and patches of darker shades running along them like veins. "Even the walls are yellow," he muttered, glancing around. "But it's not piss, or this whole place would stink of it." The air remained thick and heavy, carrying none of the stench one might expect from such an environment. It was oddly clean, sterile even, which only made the setting more unsettling. The corridor twisted sharply ahead, forcing Sukuna to turn. Each bend in the path looked nearly identical to the last, the same yellow hue stretching endlessly in both directions. Yet, he pressed forward, his eyes scanned over every surface, noting the faint lines and grooves etched into the walls. The patterns seemed random at first glance, but Sukuna's sharp gaze caught the faintest suggestion of structure beneath the chaos, subtle curves and angles that didn't belong in a mere sewer. "This place," he murmured, his voice low, "wasn't built for something as mundane as waste." He allowed his fingers to trail briefly along the wall as he walked, the texture rough and uneven beneath his touch. "No, there's more to this." The water beneath his feet deepened as he moved further in, ripples widening with each step. The air grew heavier, the silence pressing down on him, broken only by the soft splashes of his steps and the faint drip echoing in the distance. Each twist and turn of the corridor looked the same, endlessly monotonous, but Sukuna continued without pause. His pace was steady, deliberate. He wasn't lost, he was simply learning the layout of the space. "There's something deeper here," he said, his voice low, barely louder than his steps. The faint glow of the yellow walls reflected in the water, casting distorted patterns that twisted as the path curved again. "This place isn't natural, nor is it simple. Whoever designed it wasn't being subtle." He rounded another corner, and his steps halted abruptly. In front of him stood a massive cage, its bars stretching high into the shadowed ceiling, faintly illuminated by the eerie glow of the walls. A tag hung at the center of the cage, its bold characters stark against the dim light, "Seal." "A cage," Sukuna murmured, his eyes narrowing as he stepped closer. His gaze swept over the structure, every inch of it radiating an oppressive energy. "Interesting. I wonder what's in there, or perhaps, who." He moved carefully, deliberate in his approach as his senses sharpened. But as he drew closer, he suddenly stopped. His body refused to move. The energy from the cage hit him hard, slamming into him with a force that froze him in place. "What is this?" The oppressive energy radiating from the cage wasn't just strong, it was suffocating, filled with raw malevolence and hatred that seemed to dig into Sukuna's very core. He tried to push forward, to will his body to move, but it was no use. His legs refused to obey, his muscles frozen as though bound by invisible chains. "Fear." The word echoed in his mind, sharp and unfamiliar. His crimson eyes stayed locked on the towering bars of the cage, his instincts screaming at him to retreat. "Is that what this is?" The realization felt alien, unwelcome. He hadn't felt anything remotely like this since his battle with Satoru Gojo. "I feel like I'll die if I take another step, or even breathe wrong." The sheer intensity of the presence pressed down on him, suffocating and unrelenting. Sukuna's breath came slow and shallow, his mind working furiously to piece together what he was feeling. Whatever was sealed in that cage wasn't just powerful, it was overwhelming, something entirely beyond the ordinary. Then, movement. From the darkness within the cage, a crimson eye snapped open, its glow piercing through the shadows like a dagger. Sukuna's breath hitched, his body stiffening further as the weight of the energy grew heavier. The eye shifted, locking onto him with a cold, predatory focus. Slowly, the massive figure inside the cage began to stir. Chains rattled faintly as it moved, the oppressive energy ebbing and flowing like waves crashing against the walls of the corridor. The beast inside straightened slightly, its hulking form partially illuminated by the faint yellow glow of the surroundings. The creature stepped forward, its claws clicking against the ground with deliberate menace. As it drew closer to the bars, Sukuna could finally see it clearly, a massive fox, its fur blazing like fire and its 9 tails swaying ominously behind it. Each step exuded power, raw and ancient, and Sukuna felt his instinct scream louder than ever. What is that thing? He thought, his mind racing. He had fought legends, crushed countless foes beneath his feet, dominated the Heian era, tamed Mahoraga, and defeated Satoru Gojo, the strongest Six Eyes user to date, yet this presence was unlike anything he had ever encountered. It wasn't just the power, it was the sheer malevolence, an unrelenting tide of hatred and destruction. His crimson eyes narrowed, his thoughts calculating even as his body remained paralyzed. It's not just strong, it's vile. Pure hatred given form. The fox's gaze bore into him, its crimson eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and disdain. Slowly, its lips curled back, revealing sharp, glinting teeth as it spoke. To think you'd make it this far, it said, its voice deep and rumbling, carrying a weight that seemed to vibrate through the air itself. Who are you? Such ominous chakra, but a mere fraction compared to my own. Sukuna's body tensed further as the words echoed through the corridor. He tried to push back against the oppressive force, but his body refused to respond. His mind churned, weighing his options, searching for a way to regain control. But the sheer presence of the beast kept him pinned in place. The Ninetales tilted its head slightly, its gaze sharp and unyielding. As though sensing Sukuna's plight, the fox's energy shifted slightly, lessening its overwhelming killing intent just enough for Sukuna to breathe a little deeper. Pathetic human, the fox growled, its disdain palpable. Its eyes narrowed as it leaned closer to the bars, the oppressive energy still radiating in waves. Now, answer me. The Ninetales demanded as Sukuna stood before him. Now, answer me, the Ninetales demanded, its voice booming like thunder, reverberating through the mindscape. One of its massive tails lashed out, sending a gust of wind that seemed to carry the weight of its overwhelming presence. Sukuna's body refused to move. His legs felt like they were rooted in place, as if the sheer magnitude of the beast's chakra had bound him in invisible chains. His crimson eyes stayed locked on the colossal creature, every instinct screaming at him to retreat. Fear. Is that what this is? Sukuna thought as his gaze remained fixed on the fox, its massive frame radiating malice, its snarling maw and glowing crimson eyes promising nothing but destruction. No, this is more than fear, this is power. True, unrelenting power. And it's overwhelmingly evil. This thing is definitely hatred incarnate, Sukuna thought, his crimson eyes narrowing as he tried to process the situation. The oppressive energy pressing down on him had lessened, its hostility lowered just enough to let him breathe, but the sheer weight of it remained suffocating. Even with that slight reprieve. He hadn't encountered anything like this before, not in his own era nor in the countless battles that had shaped his legend. The raw malevolence radiating from this creature was in a league of its own. Is this what it felt like for my opponents when they faced me? The thought was brief but sobering. Sukuna's lips pressed into a thin line, his mind calculating. Either way, until I know exactly what this thing is capable of, I better keep my distance and play this carefully. If I had to scale this thing, it'd exceed mine, Satoru Gojo's, and Yuta Okatsu's cursed energy combine. No, even more. And it's not even using its full strength, I would guess. Sukuna knew better than to make the first move, not without understanding the full scope of the power before him. For now, observation and patience were his only weapons. How long are you going to just stand there? The Ninetales growled, its deep, rumbling voice cutting through the heavy silence. Its massive form loomed in the darkness, its crimson eyes narrowing dangerously. I asked you a question. Now answer me. Who are you? Why not give me your name first? It's rude to give your name before asking for someone else's. You've got some nerve, human. I am the nine-tailed fox, the strongest of all tailed beasts, hatred itself. I could easily kill you in an instant. Choose your words carefully, they may very well be your last. Is that so? Then why haven't you done it? Why am I still here, fox? Perhaps it's because that cage is holding you back. He hit it right on the mark. The Ninetales' growl deepened, reverberating through the mindscape like distant thunder. Its massive claws scraped against the ground, a low rumble accompanying its slow, deliberate movements as it leaned forward, its eyes burning brighter. You dare mock me? The beast snarled, its voice laced with venom. This cage is a temporary inconvenience, nothing more. You're alive only because I've chosen to let you breathe, human. Sukuna's lips curled into a faint smirk, his crimson eyes unflinching as he stared into the fox's blazing gaze. "Chosen to let me breathe," he echoed, his tone calm but edged with quiet amusement. Interesting choice of words for a creature trapped behind bars. The Nine-Tails let out a laugh, the sound deep and menacing. "Ha ha, you mistake the circumstance for weakness. If not for this seal, I would reduce you to shreds in a heartbeat." "Perhaps. But speculation doesn't suit someone of your stature, does it? After all, power confined is no power at all," Sukuna said, his smirk widening slightly despite the heavy pressure of the Nine-Tails bearing down on him. The beast's tails lashed violently, unleashing a gust of wind that tore through the mindscape. The oppressive force surged, the sheer malice pressing harder against Sukuna, threatening to overwhelm him. Yet, he stood firm, refusing to let even the faintest sign of strain show. "You test my patience, human," the Nine-Tails growled. "Tell me who you are, or I will find a way to rip it from your broken spirit." For a moment, the tension between them thickened, the oppressive energy crackling like a storm ready to break. Neither moved, their gazes locked in a silent battle of wills. After a bit, Sukuna sighed heavily, scratching the back of his head. "Look, this is obviously getting nowhere. And frankly, I've got questions of my own. So, fine, I'll answer your question. My name is Ryomen Sukuna, the King of Curses." The Nine-Tails narrowed its crimson eyes, its tail swaying behind it. "I've never heard of you." "And neither have I heard of you," Sukuna shot back smoothly, his tone flat yet laced with dry humor. "But here we are. So, let's skip the formalities, shall we?" "Very well. Now tell me, why are you here? And what is your goal? What are your intentions?" The Nine-Tails asked, its voice rumbling low and deep as the oppressive force pressing down on Sukuna lessened slightly, though not entirely. "To be honest, I don't know," Sukuna admitted, his voice calm but edged with curiosity. "I don't even know where or what this place is. Where am I? Is this some part of the afterlife, or perhaps a trial for rebirth? And more importantly, there's no cursed energy here. None at all. I know not of this energy that you speak of. But are you seriously unaware of your situation or as to why you are here?" The Nine-Tails asked, its tone sharp with skepticism. "Yes," Sukuna replied flatly, his crimson eyes narrowing slightly. "Like I just explained, I don't know." The fox regarded him for a moment, its gaze unrelenting, as if trying to pierce through Sukuna's calm facade. Then, with a low rumble, it said, "I see. Well then, allow me to enlighten you. You are within a seal," the Nine-Tails began, its voice filled with hate. "A prison created by a human who feared my power. A wretched fool who dared to confine me, the Nine-Tails, the strongest of all tailed beasts, inside the body of a mere infant. This is no afterlife, nor is it some trial for rebirth. It is a cage, designed to bind my strength and keep me trapped." "So, this is the inside of the seal?" Sukuna asked, his tone neutral as he scanned the space around him. "Yes, so to speak," the Nine-Tails replied, its crimson eyes fixed on Sukuna. "But it is more than just a seal. This space reflects the mind of the brat, a representation of his weak, disjointed mental state." Sukuna processed the information silently for a moment before speaking. "A seal, huh?" he muttered, his voice calm as he considered the explanation. "So, you're bound here, and I just happened to end up in your prison." "Not quite," the Nine-Tails growled, its tails swaying behind it, their movements radiating suppressed malice. "You are here because you are sealed within the same vessel as I am. A human child, weak and insignificant, dares to contain not only my power but now you as well. How this came to be, I cannot say, but it is the reality we now share." Sukuna raised an eyebrow at this, clearly not expecting such a revelation. "A human child? You're telling me I'm inside someone else's mindscape?" Again, a faint edge of irritation crept into his voice. "Tch, how quaint." His sharp gaze shifted back to the fox. "And yet, here you are, hatred incarnate, locked away and unable to do anything about it." The Nine-Tails snarled, its massive claws scraping against the ground, the sound reverberating like distant thunder. The air grew heavier, pressing down on Sukuna with renewed intensity. "Watch your tongue, human," it growled, its eyes blazing with fury. "I may be caged, but I am far from powerless." "Relax," Sukuna replied flatly, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. I don't doubt your strength. I'm trying to understand this situation. He gestured lazily toward the oppressive aura that still lingered in the air. So, I'm inside this child who also happens to be your prison. Fascinating. The oppressive energy eased slightly, though the Nine-Tails' presence remained oppressive. Yes, the fox growled, its tone still laced with disdain. But you are as much a mystery to me as you are to yourself. I sensed your presence within the vessel, something foreign, powerful, and yet, strangely familiar. And I cannot place why. Sukuna's crimson eyes narrowed slightly, though his expression remained unreadable. So, I don't belong here any more than you do, he said finally. That makes two of us. He paused, his tone growing sharper. Well, this just got interesting. The Nine-Tails' eyes narrowed further, watching Sukuna closely. Call it what you will. But do not mistake this for equality. This is my domain, my cage. You may be a guest here, but do not forget who holds the greater power. We'll see about that, Sukuna replied coolly. But it seems we're both stuck here for now. He paused again, his gaze turning back to the cage. So, tell me, what exactly do you want from me? The Nine-Tails growled softly, the sound rolling through the mindscape like thunder. What I want is irrelevant, it said, its voice low and deliberate. What matters is why you are here, and what you intend to do now that you know. Sukuna tilted his head slightly, his expression sharpening as his crimson eyes gleamed with intrigue. Well, isn't that the question of the hour? He replied smoothly. And one I'll answer in due time. But first, he gestured toward the cage, his gaze unwavering. I want to know more about this seal, and the boy who keeps us both confined. The boy who dares to keep us both imprisoned, his name is Naruto Uzumaki. A foolish, insignificant brat. He is nothing more than a vessel, chosen by circumstance rather than worth. Naruto Uzumaki, Sukuna repeated, the name rolling off his tongue testing it. And what makes this child so special that he could hold you, let alone both of us? The fox snarled, its tails lashing violently behind it, the motion sending a gust of oppressive energy rippling through the space. Special. He is far from it. A failure. A weakling. Barely worth the effort it takes to acknowledge him. The humans chose him because he was expendable, because no one would care if he broke under the strain. And yet, Sukuna said, he hasn't. If he were as fragile as you claim, you wouldn't be here, caged but alive. So, tell me, what's keeping him from shattering? The fox's growl deepened, its crimson eyes narrowing dangerously. Foolishness. Blind determination. A refusal to bend, even when crushed. He is stubborn, nothing more. A trait as irritating as it is baffling. It paused, its growl deepening further. Were it not for this damned seal, I would have torn free long ago. Ah. So, you admit it. The seal is what holds you back. Without it, you'd already be free. Yet, here you are, trapped while I'm out here, walking freely. And since I'm not in the cage with you, Sukuna paused, you can't lay a finger, my bad, a claw, on me. The Nine-Tails snarled again, louder this time, its massive form bristling with suppressed fury. Its claws scraped against the ground, the sound reverberating through the mindscape like thunder. Do not get comfortable, human, it growled, its voice dripping with malice. The cage may hold me back, but do not think it makes me powerless. I have other ways to deal with parasites like you. Sukuna remained, unfazed. Other ways, he repeated, now that sounds interesting. Do tell, fox, how exactly do you intend to touch me without your precious claws? The Nine-Tails' tail swayed behind it, each motion deliberate and calculated. You underestimate what it means to be hatred incarnate, it said darkly. The boy's mind is my playground, and my reach is far greater than you imagine. Cross me, and you will find that out the hard way. Sukuna chuckled softly, shaking his head. Ah, I see. Threats. Typical. His crimson eyes glinted dangerously as he locked his gaze onto the beast. But I'll bite. You stay in your cage, and I'll do what I want. Deal. The Nine-Tails didn't reply immediately, its blazing eyes narrowing further as it watched Sukuna closely. The oppressive tension between them thickened, the silence brimming with unspoken malice. Finally, it spoke, its voice low and deliberate. Do as you wish, for now human. But do not forget, this is my domain. And one misstep will be your last. Meanwhile with Naruto. Naruto sat in his small, rundown apartment, the only place he could call home. The dim light flickered above him, barely illuminating the peeling walls and cracked floor. He tried to focus on the last bite of bread he had left, but a sudden wave of dizziness hit him, making his vision blur and the room began to tilt and spin. Grimacing, he forced himself to stand, gripping the edge of the rickety table to steady himself. "What the heck?" he muttered, as he stumbled toward the kitchen. "Maybe I just need some water." He poured a glass from the faucet, gulping it down quickly, but the dizziness didn't subside. If anything, it worsened. His vision became worse, and he clutched the counter for support. "Why do I feel like this?" His breathing began to slow, becoming heavier, and he felt legs grow weak. Why isn't this working?" he grumbled, leaning heavily against the counter. Desperate for something else, he grabbed the milk carton sitting on the counter, too preoccupied to check the date. He poured himself a glass, drinking deeply in hopes of relief. The sour taste hit him like a slap to the face. Naruto gagged, spitting out what he could as he stared at the glass in disbelief. "Great. Expired milk. Seriously," he groaned, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Could this day get any worse? Apparently, it could. A sharp, searing pain shot through his head, making Naruto cry out. His hands flew to his temples as he doubled over, his vision blurring. What the hell? He groaned, his voice strained. The pain wasn't just physical, it felt like something was tearing at his very mind, pulling and clawing at the edges of his consciousness. The throbbing intensified, stabbing behind his eyes like someone was pounding on his skull with a sledgehammer. He staggered back, bumping into the wall as the sensation radiated through his entire body. What's going on?" Naruto gasped, his knees buckling under the relentless assault. It felt like someone was stomping on his thoughts, crushing them beneath an unbearable weight he couldn't escape. Black spots danced at the edges of his vision as he slid down the wall, his breathing ragged and shallow. He pressed his palms against his temples, desperate to dull the pain. "Make it stop. Just stop," he pleaded, his voice trembling as the throbbing reached its peak. It was as if something deep inside him was trying to claw its way out, raw, unrelenting, and entirely beyond his control. The pain didn't stop, it only grew worse. It felt as though molten lava was coursing through his veins, burning him from the inside out. His hands clawed at his scalp, nails digging into his skin as if that might ease the unbearable agony, but it was useless. The fire in his head spread, reaching his chest, his limbs, every corner of his body until it felt like he was being consumed by it. His breathing turned shallow and erratic as his heart thundered in his chest, loud and deafening in his ears. Stop. Just stop," he screamed, his voice breaking as he stumbled forward, slamming into the counter before collapsing to his knees. His head hit the floor, cold against his fevered skin, but it offered no relief. The pain was more than just physical, it was something deeper, clawing at him from the inside, like invisible hands were tearing at his very core. It felt like his mind was splitting apart, pulled in every direction by an unseen force that refused to let up. The pressure in his chest grew unbearable, and his body shook violently, unable to fight the storm raging within him. "What is this?" he rasped, his voice barely audible as his fingers curled into the floor. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes, but he didn't care. His body convulsed, every nerve screaming in protest as he arched against the unrelenting pain. "Why is this happening to me?" Another sharp wave of pain slammed into him, forcing a guttural scream from his throat. His body jerked violently, his head snapping back as his vision blurred. It felt like something inside him had snapped, like a dam breaking under the crushing force of a flood. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think, the pain consumed everything. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the pain stopped. Naruto collapsed against the floor, his chest heaving as the silence pressed down on him. The room was spinning, fading in and out of focus as his limbs refused to obey him. His eyes slowly closed shut, his body too weak to fight the overwhelming darkness that crept in. He felt himself falling, weightless, cold, and utterly powerless, before his mind finally slipped into unconsciousness. The Hokage office. Hiruzen Sarutobi, the third Hokage, sat at his desk battling his greatest enemy, the bane of all Kage, paperwork. It always found a way to pile up, and no matter how much he chipped away at it, it returned with a vengeance. There were times when he considered tossing it all out the window or just setting it ablaze. He had the jutsu for it, after all. But no, that would only make things worse. Reality had a way of biting back. Sighing, he took a long puff of his pipe, the scent of tobacco swirling around him as he stared at the stacks of documents on his desk. Paperwork was bad enough on its own, but with the village still recovering from the Nine Tails attack 8 years ago, it had become unbearable. Konoha was still limping back to full strength, and rebuilding wasn't cheap, financially or emotionally. His desk was buried under towering stacks of papers, each one demanding his attention. Mission approvals, maintenance reports, academy funding requests, budget allocations for the orphanage, petitions from clans for more resources, trade disputes, complaints from merchants about rogue shinobi, and civilian grievances about property lines. And those were just the urgent ones. Half of this should have been the council's responsibility, but they always found ways to shove the real work onto him. Hokage should lead by example, they'd say. Hiruzen had stopped believing that excuse years ago. He leaned back in his chair, massaging his temples as the beginnings of a headache crept in. It wasn't just village matters he had to handle. There were border disputes with other nations, requests for alliances, veiled threats from other Kage, and endless correspondence with the daimyo's office, which seemed to take delight in reminding him how much funding Konoha received from the Fire Country. And if that wasn't enough, there were nobles demanding shinobi for private assignments and merchants whining about taxes. Then, of course, there were the complaints about Naruto Uzumaki. Those came in like clockwork, dressed up as concerns for the village's safety. Hiruzen wasn't fooled. They weren't concerned about the village, they just wanted the boy gone. It always left a bitter taste in his mouth, but he dealt with it. He had to. A child who carries the burden of their survival, Hiruzen thought grimly, taking another puff of his pipe. They hate him because they fear him. They fear him because they're too blind to see the truth. He sighed again, setting his pipe down as he scanned the stacks. Kami, Minato, what a mess you left me, he muttered, a mix of fondness and frustration creeping into his voice. If Minato were here, Hiruzen had no doubt he'd have found a way to handle the paperwork and still keep his ever-present smile and have time for other things. Thinking of his now-dead successor brought a deep sadness to Hiruzen's heart. Minato had been a good man, kind, selfless, and fiercely loyal to the village. He loved Konoha and his wife, Kushina, with all his being. Yet, both their lives had been stripped away from them far too soon, at the young age of just 24. They left behind their only child, Naruto, alone in the world, never knowing the love of a father or mother. Minato and Kushina had entrusted Naruto to Hiruzen's care. Minato thought the village would honor their son as a hero for bearing the burden of the Nine Tails. But reality, as it so often was, proved to be cruel. Instead of gratitude, Naruto faced hatred, scorn, and isolation from the very people his parents had sacrificed everything to protect. It was a real slap in the face, as if fate itself had conspired against Naruto's happiness. The boy had already been robbed of so much: his parents, his family, and any sense of a normal life or childhood. As Hiruzen sat there, his thoughts were interrupted when the phone rang. He picked up the phone, adjusting his pipe as he spoke. "This is Hiruzen." The voice on the other end was blunt and irritated. "Yeah, this is Naruto's landlord." "What's this about?" Hiruzen asked. "Look, I don't care what that brat gets up to, but the other tenants are complaining," the landlord said, not even attempting to hide his annoyance. "They're saying they've been hearing crying, loud crying, coming from his apartment. Like the kid's in pain or something." Hiruzen straightened in his chair, his tone immediately sharper. "Crying, in pain, how long has this been going on?" "Don't know. Don't care," the landlord said bluntly. "It started a little while ago, and now everyone's at my door are calling complaining. You're the one who gave him the apartment, so deal with it." Hiruzen closed his eyes briefly, suppressing his irritation at the man's callousness. "Thank you for informing me, I'll handle it." He hung up the phone, the click quiet but final, as he rose from his chair. Grabbing his hat, Hiruzen hurried out the door, heading straight for Naruto's place. He didn't know what was wrong, but he couldn't ignore this. Naruto had never done anything like this before. Sure, the boy pulled pranks, caused mischief here and there, but this didn't feel like one of those times. Something about it sat heavy in Hiruzen's chest, a gnawing unease that told him this wasn't just another stunt. Whatever was happening, he needed to find out, and fast. Naruto apartment. Hiruzen moved as quickly as his legs would carry him, the unease in his chest growing with every step. Reaching the building where Naruto lived, he hurried up the stairs to Naruto apartment and knocked firmly 3 times. Naruto. Naruto, if you're there, open this door. He shouted. A second passed. Then another. Nothing. His frown deepened, and he knocked again, harder this time, his voice sharper. Naruto. Answer me. Still no response. When the silence stretched on, a cold dread began creeping up his spine. His heart pounded in his chest, feeling as though it might stop entirely. Without another second of hesitation, Hiruzen pushed forward, with the vigor of a man half his age forcing the door open. The lock gave way under the strength of his urgency. His breathing stopped at the sight before him. Naruto was sprawled on the floor, motionless, blood pooling on the worn wooden floorboards beneath him. Hiruzen's stomach twisted as he hurried inside, kneeling beside the boy. Naruto, he shouted, as he placed 2 fingers on the boy's neck, feeling for a pulse. It was there, weak, but steady. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. Something was very wrong. He placed a hand on Naruto's forehead, feeling for a fever or any sign of illness, and his eyes widened. The boy's skin was burning hot, radiating an unnatural heat. Hiruzen's stomach twisted as he tried to make sense of it. The weak pulse he had already checked was still there, but this heat, it wasn't normal. It felt wrong, unnatural in every sense of the word. Come on, Naruto, he muttered, shaking the boy's shoulder lightly. Wake up. Still nothing. Naruto's shallow breathing and pale complexion only worsened the unease clawing at Hiruzen. The metallic tang of blood filled the air, mixing with the faint sour scent of spoiled milk lingering on the counter. Hiruzen's sharp eyes caught sight of the glass on the sink, but it didn't account for the blood or the strange ripple of chakra he could now feel emanating faintly from the boy. His gaze shifted to Naruto's stomach as a thought struck him. Without hesitation, he brushed the hem of the boy's shirt aside, exposing the intricate swirl of the seal that bound the 9 tails. It glowed faintly in the dim light, and Hiruzen's frown deepened. The seal looked intact, but there it was again, a faint ripple of chakra. Subtle, yet unmistakable. Something was off. As the 9 tails stirring, he muttered to himself, his tone heavy with dread. He couldn't be sure, but the possibility sent a chill down his spine. If something was interfering with the seal, or worse, trying to break it, it could spell disaster for both Naruto and the village. This isn't bad, Hiruzen said under his breath, standing up quickly, and he turned to the door. Anbu, I need assistance immediately. 2 masked figures appeared at the doorway within seconds, their stances alert. Hokage-sama, one of them said, stepping forward. What are your orders? Have a medical team ready for us at the hospital, Hiruzen instructed. The Anbu nodded and vanished without a word. Hiruzen knelt once more, carefully lifting Naruto into his arms. The boy was far too light, another painful reminder of the hardships he endured. As he held Naruto close, the faint pulse of the seal seemed to press against his chest, a subtle reminder of the dangerous power contained within the boy. Stay with me, Naruto, Hiruzen said quietly, his voice strained. You're more important than you know, we can't lose you. Without another moment's hesitation, he carried the boy out of the apartment. His mind churned with possibilities as he moved swiftly through the streets toward the hospital. Whatever this was, whether the 9 tails or something else, he would get to the bottom of it. Inside the seal, Sukuna's crimson eyes narrowed as the oppressive silence of the mindscape was broken. He had been observing the 9 tails, its massive form coiled within its cage, when he felt it, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. His gaze swept the surroundings, sharp and calculating. He muttered, something's off. What's going on? The 9 tails stirred, its massive form shifting within the cage. Its crimson eyes burned brighter, and its tails lashed out, radiating raw energy that made the air feel heavier. as its gaze locked onto Sukuna. It seems, the Nine Tails began, its voice rumbling through the mindscape, that our presence here is having unintended consequences. Sukuna turned his gaze back to the Nine Tails, tch. What are you getting at, Fox? Explain. My hatred has been unleashed in greater measure than usual, and your presence here has placed undue strain on the boy's mind. The boy's mind was already fragile, but now, with the strain of all this, it paused, its tone darkening. His condition has become unstable, but not fatal. He won't die, but this instability, it will linger. For how long, even I cannot say. Sukuna crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. So, you're saying this is out of our hands? That there's nothing either of us can do? It would seem so, the Nine Tails replied. Konoha Hospital. Naruto lay unconscious on a bed in the hospital, his small frame looking even frailer beneath the stark white sheets. The steady beep of the heart monitor echoed in the room, a rhythmic reminder that he was alive, though his condition remained uncertain. Hiruzen stood near the bed with arms crossed, his face displayed worry as he watched the medical team work. He had brought Naruto to the hospital himself, carrying the boy while his Anbu operatives arrived ahead of him to secure the area. He knew better than to leave the boy vulnerable, not here. The hatred and prejudice Naruto faced every day extended even to the hospital staff. Hiruzen could see it in their cold glances, and hear it in the flat, detached way they spoke about the boy. The nurses and doctors moved around Naruto's bed with the precision their duties required, but their faces betrayed their true feelings. The doctors and nurses did their duty only because Hiruzen was standing there watching, his presence forced them to act professionally. His vitals are stable, one of the nurses reported flatly, barely sparing a glance at Naruto as she adjusted the IV line in his arm. Her tone was professional but detached. But his chakra levels are fluctuating erratically. It's strange. Strange how? Hiruzen asked, his tone calm but firm. The nurse hesitated, clearly reluctant to explain. Then another nurse, older and less cautious, spoke, her hatred had poorly concealed as she spoke. It's almost like something's interfering with it, though who knows what with him, she muttered under her breath, her eyes flicking briefly to Naruto. Hiruzen's sharp gaze snapped to her, and she immediately stiffened, her mouth snapping shut. Speak clearly, he said coldly. And keep your personal feelings out of this. The nurse nodded quickly, muttering an apology, and stepped back. The head doctor, sensing the tension, stepped forward with a clipboard in his hand. Hokage-sama, he began, flipping through a clipboard. The preliminary scans are inconclusive. Physically, the boy has no significant injuries aside from the nosebleed, which stopped before you arrived with him. Internally, however, his chakra network shows severe strain, similar to what we might see in someone pushing their limits during a high-level jutsu. There's no permanent damage, but whatever caused this pushed him to his limit. His tone was carefully calm, but the irritation in his voice was obvious. If he had it his way, he wouldn't help Naruto at all. And yet, Hiruzen said, his voice stern, Naruto was alone in his apartment. There was no one and nothing to cause such strain. Can you explain? The doctor adjusted his glasses, avoiding Hiruzen's gaze. I can't, Hokage-sama. There's no logical explanation. It's unusual, to say the least. But as I stated, there is no permanent damage to his pathways, for now. Another nurse glanced nervously at the Hokage before speaking. The seal on his stomach, it glowed faintly earlier. Whatever triggered it has stopped, but it's still troubling. Hiruzen's expression darkened as he shifted his gaze to the seal on Naruto's exposed stomach. He had inspected it himself at Naruto's apartment when he found him, and again upon arriving at the hospital, this time more thoroughly. And while it remained intact, the fact that it had reacted at all was alarming. The fourth Hokage's seal was extremely powerful, designed to withstand even the Nine Tails' immense power. For it to activate without reason. His thoughts churned as he stared at the intricate swirl. Minato placed this seal himself. He poured everything into it, his very life, and it was Kushina who had taught it to him. It shouldn't just react like this without provocation. What could have triggered it? The Nine Tails is still contained. I would have felt if its chakra were breaking free, everyone would have felt it. And yet, nothing. The ripple I felt when the seal glowed, was it a warning? An anomaly? Or something worse? This has never happened before. Hiruzen said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. His sharp eyes swept over the medical team, lingering on their hesitant movements and averted gazes. He could feel their contempt for the boy lying helpless in the bed. For a moment, Hiruzen contemplated contacting Jiraiya. The Toad Sage had a wealth of knowledge about seals, and his involvement in Naruto's life would be invaluable. But Hiruzen quickly dismissed the idea. Jiraiya was in the middle of an important mission, one that could potentially affect the future of the entire village. Distracting him now was a risk he couldn't afford to take. Still, Hiruzen thought grimly, his gaze fixed on Naruto's pale face. I can't ignore this. Something happened to that seal, and I need to understand why before it happens again. The steady beeping of the heart monitor was a stark contrast to the turmoil in Hiruzen's mind. He turned to the head doctor, his voice sharp with authority. Has the chakra network stabilized? The doctor hesitated, glancing at the monitor before replying. For now, yes. But the fluctuations earlier were unlike anything we've recorded before. If it happens again, he trailed off, his tone suggesting he wouldn't mourn the boy if it did. Hiruzen's eyes narrowed. It won't happen again, he said firmly, though the unease in his chest betrayed his confidence. Outside, the Anbu operatives stood stationed by the door, their presence a silent reminder of Hiruzen's authority. He had sent them ahead for this very reason. Naruto needed protection, even here. Especially here. Hiruzen turned back to the head doctor, his sharp gaze pinning the man in place. Keep monitoring him closely, he instructed, his tone cold and commanding. Any changes, no matter how minor, are to be reported to me immediately. If he so much as sneezes, I want to know. And do not let personal feelings interfere with your duty. Or there will be consequences. The room seemed to grow colder as the Hokage's words settled. The head doctor swallowed hard, a bead of sweat forming at his temple despite the neutral expression he tried to maintain. He bowed slightly, his voice tight as he replied, Yes, Hokage-sama. Hiruzen's piercing gaze sweeping over the rest of the medical staff. That goes for all of you, he said. A wave of unease rippled through the room. The nurses and doctors exchanged nervous glances, their earlier contempt replaced by a growing sense of dread. The air itself seemed heavier, charged with an invisible pressure that prickled at the edges of their consciousness. One of the younger nurses, standing by the monitor, felt her knees weaken slightly. Though the Hokage's tone remained calm, there was an unspoken force behind his words, a silent reminder of who he was. This wasn't just the kind old man they whispered about behind closed doors. This was the third Hokage, the professor, a man who had lived through wars and commanded respect not just through his title, but through his actions. The killing intent emanating from Hiruzen was subtle yet undeniable, like a blade pressed lightly against their throats. The head doctor clenched the clipboard in his hands, his palms damp with sweat. Yes, Hokage-sama, the head doctor repeated, bowing a little lower this time. Satisfied, Hiruzen turned back to Naruto, the intensity in his gaze softening just slightly as he looked at the boy. But the weight in the room remained, lingering like a shadow long after the Hokage's focus had shifted. The medical staff busied themselves in silence, their movements quick and precise. None of them dared to meet Hiruzen's eyes again, their earlier disdain buried beneath the oppressive reality of his authority. Hiruzen knelt beside the boy once more, brushing the edge of the blanket back to expose the seal. He placed a hand over it, feeling the faint ripple of chakra beneath his palm. The glowing had been stopped, but it left behind more questions than answers. His gaze lingered on Naruto as his mind raced through possibilities. If the seal is intact, then this must be external. But who or what could have caused such a disturbance? There hasn't been any sign of tampering, not from within or without. And Naruto himself, he frowned. Even if his chakra network is strained, he doesn't have the capacity to disrupt the seal on his own. Whatever caused this disturbance, I must find the source. Otherwise, I fear we could all perish, and this could very well lead to another war. Hiruzen let out a deep sigh as his hand lingering on Naruto's small frame for a moment before he stood and turned to leave the room. The moment the Hokage exited, the two Anbu operatives entered the room. Their masks revealed nothing, but their presence spoke volumes. They were more than just guards, they were there as enforcers, a reminder to the doctors and nurses of what would happen if they dared to let their personal prejudices interfere with their duties. Hiruzen wasn't naive. He knew that leaving Naruto in the care of these individuals was a risk. Their glares and muttered remarks had made their feelings all too clear. Despite the fear his killing intent had instilled in them, it could only suppress their hatred, it wouldn't erase it. But that was precisely why the Anbu were there. Should anyone be foolish enough to act on their prejudice and harm the boy, they'd be met with a swift and brutal end. One of the Anbu moved to the corner of the room, standing silently like a shadow, their masked gaze fixed on the staff. The other remained stationed by the door, their presence suffocating in its quiet intensity. The medical staff exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier contempt simmered just beneath the surface, but the fear of retribution kept their hands steady and their mouths shut. Whatever thoughts they harbored, they knew better than to act on them now. Inside the seal, Naruto was unconscious as he laid there, his body limp and his breathing steady. He was completely unaware of the two beings watching him, and that they were responsible for the excruciating pain he had felt and the state he was in. "So, this is the boy, huh?" Sukuna said, as he observed Naruto's body for the first time. He crouched and examined Naruto from head to toe, noting the boy's small, frail frame. The child looked to be about 8 years old, perhaps a couple of years older. He had red hair with golden blonde tips, and 3 whisker marks on each cheek that stood out subtly against his pale skin. Sukuna's gaze then shifted to the boy's closed eyes, his curiosity got the better of him and he reached out. Using 2 fingers, he carefully lifted one of Naruto's eyelids. The boy's celestial blue iris caught the faint light of the mindscape, its brilliance momentarily holding Sukuna's attention, the only person he'd seen with eyes as blue as these. His mind drifted to Satoru Gojo. "Tch," Sukuna muttered, releasing Naruto's eyelid. Gojo's eyes were sharper. A limitless void reflected in those accursed 6 eyes of his. But this, he paused, his gaze lingering on Naruto. This is different. No calculation, no control, just raw potential untapped. A canvas waiting for someone to paint it, though I wonder if this brat will ever hold a brush. Gojo's eyes had been a reflection of his mastery, of his unrivaled understanding of cursed energy and cursed techniques. But this boy's eyes, they felt unrefined. The potential was there, buried beneath weakness and inexperience. Yet the thought intrigued him, what would these eyes become under the right circumstances? Feeling intrigued, Sukuna decided to delve deeper. He placed a hand on Naruto's chest in the center, his fingers pressing lightly against the boy's small chest, and he began to examine Naruto's soul. Almost immediately, Sukuna's eyes widened in surprise. There it was again, that strange energy. It was similar to the malevolent force that radiated from the fox in the cage, but at the same time it was different, it lacked that malevolent feeling. And this strange energy that both the fox and this possessed felt similar to cursed energy, but it wasn't the same. This energy felt more alive, vibrant even. It lacked the decay and bitterness that typically accompanied cursed energy. Instead, it pulsed with a vitality that was both fascinating and unsettling, as though it were tied intrinsically to life itself. And what he found surprising was that this boy, he seemed to have a large amount of it. Sukuna's hand lingered on Naruto's chest as he assessed the scale of the energy. The sheer volume was staggering, easily equal to 5, no, 6, of his previous 20 cursed fingers. How could a child possess this much power? Impressive. For someone so small, you're carrying quite the burden, aren't you, brat? He said as he removed his hand from Naruto's chest, but his gaze remained fixed on his unconscious form. This energy wasn't just abundant, it was volatile, raw and untamed, swirling through the boy's body like a storm. The gears in Sukuna's mind turned as he considered the implications. What kind of child could handle such immense power without being torn apart? Who were his parents that had given birth to him? Perhaps the answer lies there. It's no wonder the fox is in a cage. This energy, if left unchecked, it would devour the boy from the inside out. But who sealed the fox in him and why? Sukuna thought, then he turned and looked at the 9 tails. I don't suppose you'd be willing to answer my question, right, fox? I've already given you more than enough answers, human. I am not obliged to give you more. Now, leave me alone. I have no further interest in you or that brat. You're both powerless against me, especially you. The 9 tails said, then it retreated deeper into the cage. To it, Sukuna was nothing more than a parasite that he couldn't quite figure out, and happened to be sealed into the boy. Whatever Sukuna did, as long as he didn't interfere with the Nine-Tails' plans, then it didn't care. Sukuna watched the beast retreat further into the recess of its cage before turning back to Naruto, who was still unconscious. I expected as much. Well, it looks like I'll have to go through the boy's memories, but first, Sukuna stood and walked forward for a little bit before stopping. The fox said that it and I are sealed in the boy, and that this is a reflection of his mind. If so then, he raised his right leg and stomped on the ground, causing a large cascading effect as ripples moved out and the mindscape shook a bit. He waited for a few moments, then it happened. The water that once looked yellow was dyed red, and made sure Naruto wasn't hurt. Sukuna walked up to the throne and sat down on it. He made this part of the seal similar to the inner world he had when he was inside of Yuji Itadori. Ah, that's a lot better. Now to see what's in this boy's mind and what I can learn from it. Sukuna said as he leaned forward on his knuckles and watched Naruto's life unfold. The first thing he saw was Naruto sitting somewhere and there were other children around. At this time Naruto looked to be about 3 years old. Then a woman walked up giving them food and Naruto watched, but when she got him her face twisted in disgust. She seemed like she was debating even feeding him. Naruto's stomach growled as he waited and then she gave him some scraps, the last of the food, but that was it. After that she walked away, not saying a word or being kind to him like she was to all the other children. On other days different staff members worked at what Sukuna figured was an orphanage, and they were just as bad if not worse. Naruto was often starved, going hungry at night, and depending on the season freezing or hot as well. He wasn't allowed to sleep with the other children. He was given a worn-out cot that smelled like someone puked and wet themselves, and the blanket he was given, counting they didn't take it away, was old and worn, threadbare, barely holding together. And his clothes were the same but slightly better. The orphanage staff didn't bother locking the door of the room he was in. They knew he wouldn't dare try to leave. The room was cold and dark. The only sound was the occasional scurry of rats and mice along the walls. Another instance was he had to wait till all the children were done bathing and he barely had any soap. All the hot water was used up and the water was dirty. Yet they made him get in anyways. Despite his age even he could tell this water wasn't good for him, but he didn't have a choice. If he didn't he'd be punished, and he knew very well what that entailed. He was also abused by some of the staff members. He'd be pushed around, shoved or beat under the guise of punishing him. They didn't want the demon to fight back, so what better way to make him feel like he deserved it? It got worse as Naruto's life spiraled deeper into a living nightmare. Each day at the orphanage blurred into a relentless cycle of neglect and cruelty that would have broken anyone else, let alone a 3-year-old. The staff made it a point to remind him, in subtle and overt ways, that he was nothing, less than nothing. A monster, a burden, a mistake that should have never been born. When mealtime came he wasn't allowed to eat with the others at the table. Instead, he was forced to sit on the cold, dirty floor in the corner of the dining hall, away from their laughter and warmth. The staff would toss him whatever remained, often bruised fruit, stale bread, or gristle that even stray dogs would reject. If he dared complain, he wouldn't eat at all. One particularly cruel staff member once spat in his bowl of watery porridge before handing it to him, sneering as she muttered, "Eat up, demon. It's more than you deserve." Winter was the worst. The orphanage barely heated the building, and Naruto's corner room might as well have been outside. The windows were cracked, letting in freezing drafts that bit into his skin. His thin blanket provided no comfort, and his threadbare clothes did little to shield him from the cold. Nights were a torment of shivering and huddling in the fetal position, desperately trying to conserve what little warmth his small body could generate. But the worst part, the most soul-crushing agony, wasn't the physical abuse or the starvation, it was the isolation. Naruto didn't understand why everyone hated him. He didn't know why the staff sneered at him, why the other children avoided him like a plague. He didn't know why the villagers outside the orphanage glared at him with such venom when he accompanied the staff on errands. All he wanted was what he saw other children receiving so easily: a kind word, a warm touch, a smile meant for him. Instead, he got cold stares and cruel laughter. He once tried to make a friend. A new boy, about his age, had arrived at the orphanage. Naruto thought, maybe, just maybe, this boy wouldn't hate him. He offered the boy one of his few possessions, a small wooden carving he had found in the trash and cleaned up. The boy hesitated, his eyes wide with curiosity, but before he could accept, one of the staff members swooped in, snatching the carving from Naruto's hands. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, glaring at him. "You don't get to bribe people into liking you, demon." She smashed the carving against the wall, splintering it into pieces, and dragged Naruto away by his ear as he sobbed. The boy never spoke to Naruto again. Sukuna watched as this all unfolded. He too had the same question: why do they hate this boy? To treat him like this, and he's just a child, and they keep calling him a demon. Is it something his parents did? Or perhaps did they know of the fox and fear his power? But if that's the case, why not just outright kill him? Sukuna speculated a bit more, but seeing he was getting nowhere, he continued going through Naruto memories. The next thing he saw was that when Naruto turned 4, the matron had shoved Naruto out, not even bothering to give him a coat or shoes to protect him from the biting chill of the autumn air. He stumbled down the orphanage steps, his small frame swaying as he tried to balance on his frail legs. Her words, "You're nothing but a curse, a demon that should never have been born," echoed in the air behind him as the heavy door slammed shut. Naruto stood there for a moment, his breath visible in the frosty air. His tiny hands clenched at the frayed ends of his shirt as he looked around, his blue eyes wide with confusion and fear. He didn't understand why he had been thrown out. What had he done this time? The orphanage had been cold and cruel, but at least it was somewhere to sleep, somewhere to be. Now, even that had been taken from him. Sukuna observed as Naruto began wandering aimlessly, his steps hesitant and uneven. The streets of Konoha were eerily quiet that night, but the few villagers who passed him didn't spare him a glance, or if they did, it was only to sneer or mutter curses under their breath. A shopkeeper carrying a sack of goods deliberately swerved into Naruto's path, knocking him over without so much as an apology. The boy hit the ground with a soft cry, his hands scraping against the rough stone road. Naruto didn't cry. He sat there for a moment, staring at his scrapped palms, before slowly pushing himself back to his feet. His knees wobbled, but he managed to stand. The boy kept moving, his small, bare feet slapping against the cold, damp ground. The wind picked up, tugging at his tattered shirt and chilling him to the bone. He wrapped his arms around himself, his breath coming out in trembling puffs. His stomach growled loudly, but there was nothing he could do about it. He hadn't eaten that day, again. Sukuna scoffed. "Pathetic," he muttered, though his voice lacked its usual venom. There was no satisfaction in watching this boy's misery. If anything, it left an odd, bitter taste in his mouth. A child like this, stripped of everything, even the most basic human kindness. Sukuna had seen cruelty in his own time, but this was an entire community united in their hatred for one child. It was disgusting. Naruto continued wandering until his legs gave out, collapsing in an alleyway between two closed shops. He curled up into a ball, pressing his back against the cold wall and tucking his knees under his chin. His body shook violently as the cold seeped into his bones. The only sounds were the distant murmurs of the villagers and the occasional barking of stray dogs. Hours passed. Sukuna could feel the boy's body growing weaker, his breathing shallow. A lesser child would have succumbed to the cold by now, but Naruto's small frame clung stubbornly to life. His fingers twitched, his blue eyes half-lidded as he fought to stay conscious. The alley was dark and narrow, the kind of place people avoided, the kind of place no one would think to check. Naruto's small figure was almost invisible, hidden in the shadows as the night dragged on. Sukuna observed the boy's struggle, the defiant spark in him refusing to extinguish even as his young body was reaching its limits. He couldn't help but be impressed by the boy's resilience. Despite all that was happening, he still clung to life and didn't get sick while having no protection from the elements. This lasted for days. Then one night, as Naruto lay in an alley asleep, an Anbu with a dog mask found him shivering in the streets. The next day, the Hokage had taken him in, giving him a small apartment and enough money to survive. The old man had been kind, and Naruto appreciated it, but it couldn't fill the void in Naruto's heart. The next memory unfolded as Sukuna watched Naruto's life shift after the Hokage intervened, but the improvement was only superficial, a plaster over a gaping wound. Sukuna observed as the old man, Hiruzen Sarutobi, handed Naruto a key to a modest apartment. It was more space than Naruto had ever had, but it was cold, empty, and bare. No decorations, no personal touches, just a single bed, a small kitchen, and a window that rattled in the wind. Hiruzen had tried to smile, tried to reassure the boy that this was his new home, but even Sukuna could see the weight of the old man's guilt. He knew this wasn't enough, and yet, it was all he could give. Naruto's first night in the apartment was painfully quiet. Sukuna watched as the boy wandered the small space, his bare feet patting softly against the wooden floor. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the cracked walls, his blue eyes wide with uncertainty. The silence was oppressive, the kind that pressed down on his small frame like a physical weight. He curled up under the thin blanket, his body trembling, not from the cold this time, but from the unfamiliarity of it all. For the first time in his young life, he was truly alone. The next day, Naruto ventured out into the village. Sukuna followed the boy's memories as he wandered through the bustling streets, his small figure weaving between villagers who barely noticed him, or if they did, they glared with open hostility. The whispers followed him wherever he went. Why is he still here? That brat should have died with the fox. Don't let him near the kids. Naruto pretended not to hear, but Sukuna could see the way his shoulders hunched, the way his pace quickened as he tried to escape their venomous stares. The boy found a small market stall selling cheap bowls of noodles and handed over a few crumpled bills from the allowance Hiruzen had given him. The shopkeeper's face twisted with disgust as he accepted the money, slamming the bowl down on the counter with unnecessary force. Naruto flinched but said nothing, taking his food and retreating to a corner where he could eat in peace, or at least, where he could pretend to. As Sukuna continued to observe, he noticed a pattern. The villagers' hatred was relentless, unyielding, and completely unfounded. Naruto wasn't even old enough to have done anything to earn their ire. He was just a child with no family, no support, no understanding of why the world seemed to despise him. Sukuna couldn't comprehend it. In his own time, strength dictated worth, and the weak were cast aside. But this boy wasn't weak. He had survived more in his few years than most adults could endure, and still, he stood. Naruto's resilience became even more apparent as he grew older. Sukuna watched as the boy learned to fend for himself, scrounging for food when his meager allowance ran out and repairing his own clothes when they tore. He made do with what little he had, finding creative solutions to problems that no child should have to face. Yet, despite his resourcefulness, the loneliness never left him. It clung to him like a shadow, a constant reminder of the isolation that had been forced upon him. One day, Naruto tried to join a group of children playing in the streets. Sukuna observed as the boy approached cautiously, his steps hesitant but hopeful. He offered them a small, awkward smile, his blue eyes bright with anticipation. But the other children stopped playing the moment they noticed him. One of them sneered, pointing at Naruto with a cruel laugh. Why would we play with a monster like you? Naruto's smile faltered, but he didn't give up. I'm not a monster, he said softly, his voice barely audible over their laughter. I just want to play. The oldest of the group stepped forward, a smug grin on his face. Get lost, he said, shoving Naruto backward. The boy stumbled but didn't fall. His fists clenched at his sides as he stood his ground, his determination shining through despite the tears welling in his eyes. I'm not going anywhere, Naruto said, his voice stronger this time. The other children laughed, and the oldest boy shoved him again, harder this time. Naruto hit the ground with a thud, but he didn't cry. He pushed himself back up, his small frame trembling with anger and frustration. Leave me alone, he shouted, his voice cracking. The group of children scattered, laughing as they ran off, leaving Naruto alone in the street. He stood there for a moment, his fists clenched, his head bowed. Then, slowly, he turned and walked away, his steps heavy with defeat. Sukuna couldn't look away. The boy's pain was raw and unfiltered, his emotions laid bare for anyone to see. And yet, no one did. No one cared. The world seemed determined to break him, but Naruto refused to shatter. There was something about that defiance, that stubborn refusal to give up, that struck a chord with Sukuna. He continued watching as Naruto's life progressed into the next chapter of his hardships, the Konoha Ninja Academy. The memories shifted, showing Naruto entering the academy for the first time. He was smaller than the other children, his bright red and golden-tipped hair messy and his clothes slightly oversized. Despite the harsh treatment he had endured up to this point, there was an undeniable spark in his blue eyes, a bit of hope and excitement at the prospect of becoming a shinobi. But the academy was no haven for Naruto, it was yet another battlefield. From the very beginning, the instructors made it clear that they wanted nothing to do with him. They ignored his questions, overlooked his raised hand during lessons, and barely offered him the bare minimum of instruction. When Naruto struggled with a particular technique, they offered no guidance, no advice to help him improve. If anything, they seemed to take pleasure in watching him fail. "Pay attention, Uzumaki," one instructor barked during a kunai throwing exercise, his tone harsh and unforgiving. "Maybe if you stopped fooling around, you'd actually hit the target for once." Naruto flinched at the reprimand but didn't argue. He bit his lip, forcing himself to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. He knew by now that crying wouldn't get him anywhere. It never had. Instead, he gritted his teeth and picked up another kunai, his small hands trembling slightly as he aimed. The kunai missed the target by a wide margin, and the instructor snorted in disdain. "Hopeless," the man muttered under his breath, loud enough for Naruto to hear. The other students weren't much better. They whispered and snickered behind his back, their laughter cutting through the air like knives. "Did you see that? He couldn't even hit the target. No wonder everyone calls him a failure." Naruto pretended not to hear, his face carefully blank as he retrieved his kunai and tried again. He threw with all his strength, his movements fueled by frustration and determination, but the result was the same. The blade landed nowhere near the target. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his nails digging into his palms as he fought to keep his emotions in check. Despite the constant ridicule and neglect, Naruto refused to give up. After each lesson, he stayed behind, practicing long after the other students had left. He threw kunai until his arms ached, ran laps around the training grounds until his legs felt like they would give out, and practiced the basic hand seals over and over again until his fingers felt numb. Sukuna observed as the boy pushed himself to his limits, day after day, with no one to guide him or offer encouragement. Naruto's determination was remarkable, but it was also painfully lonely. He trained in solitude, the empty training grounds his only companion. The other students had families, friends, mentors, people who supported them and celebrated their progress. Naruto had none of that. His victories, however small, went unnoticed, and his failures were met with scorn. One particularly harsh memory stood out. It was a written exam day, and Naruto had struggled to answer the questions on the test. He wasn't stupid, far from it, but the lack of guidance and the cruel remarks from the instructors had worn down his confidence. When the results were announced, Naruto's name was at the very bottom of the list. The instructor didn't bother to hide his disdain as he handed Naruto his paper. "Fail again, Uzumaki," the man sneered. "You'll never make it as a ninja at this rate." Naruto stared at the paper in his hands, his vision blurring as tears welled up in his eyes. He clenched the sheet tightly, his knuckles white, and forced himself to swallow the lump in his throat. He wouldn't cry, not here, not in front of them. He shoved the paper into his bag and left the classroom without a word, his steps quick and purposeful as he made his way to the training grounds. That night, Sukuna watched as Naruto stood alone in the moonlit clearing, his breath visible in the chilly air. The boy practiced the clone jutsu over and over again, despite his exhaustion. Each attempt left him more drained than the last, but he didn't stop. He refused to stop. "I'll show them," Naruto muttered, his voice low and trembling. "I'll prove them wrong. I'll get stronger, no matter what." The jutsu fizzled out once more, and Naruto fell to his knees, his body trembling with fatigue. He pounded the ground with his fists, frustration etched across his face. But even then, he didn't cry. He sat there for a long moment, his chest heaving as he caught his breath, before slowly pushing himself back to his feet. Sukuna couldn't help but be impressed. Despite the overwhelming odds stacked against him, the boy kept going. He failed, and he failed again, but he never stopped trying. That stubborn resilience was a trait Sukuna recognized well. It was the same unyielding spirit that had driven him to become the king of curses in his own time. The memories continued to unfold, revealing the years of relentless effort that defined Naruto's time at the academy. He studied late into the night, using worn-out textbooks that Hiruzen had given him. He practiced jutsu in the woods, using trees as makeshift targets. He trained his body, running laps around the village and doing push-ups until his arms gave out. But no matter how hard he worked, it was never enough. The academy instructors continued to dismiss him, their disdain for him as blatant as ever. And when Naruto failed the graduation exam for the second time, Sukuna felt an unfamiliar twinge of anger. Not at Naruto, but at the village that had set him up to fail. "This village, they've done everything they can to break you," he muttered, his voice low and contemplative. "And yet, here you are, still standing. Still fighting. You're either a fool or the strongest brat I've ever seen." Sukuna then turned his attention inward, focusing on the strange energy within the boy, chakra, they called it. He had observed the villagers and academy instructors use it during demonstrations. Chakra was a fusion of mental and physical energy, a concept foreign to Sukuna, yet fascinating in its potential. Unlike cursed energy, which was born of negative emotions, hatred, fear, and sorrow, chakra felt more balanced, almost alive. It lacked the decay and bitterness of cursed energy, but it was no less potent. Naruto, despite his lack of formal instruction, was brimming with the stuff. He watched the way the boy trained relentlessly, his chakra flaring with each failed attempt to perform what they called a jutsu. The hand signs, or hand seals as they were called, were used to mold chakra into specific techniques, the same way cursed techniques shaped cursed energy. The similarities were undeniable, and Sukuna found himself intrigued by the system's complexity. Jutsu, Jujutsu, Sukuna mused, a dry chuckle escaping his lips. The names are too close to be a coincidence. What kind of world have I ended up in? The memories revealed more than just the mechanics of chakra, they also painted a grim picture of Naruto's suffering. Sukuna had pieced together the story of the nine-tailed fox, the Kyuubi, as the villagers called it. The fourth Hokage, Minato Namikaze, had sealed the beast within Naruto on the night of its rampage. The villagers hailed Minato as a hero for his sacrifice, but they despised the boy who bore the burden of the fox's imprisonment. "Hypocrites," he muttered. "They praise the man who caged the beast but condemn the child who keeps it locked away and keeps your dumb asses alive." What the fox hadn't mentioned, but Sukuna had deduced, was that only half of it was sealed within Naruto. The rest was gone, likely consumed in some ritual or scattered into the ether. Sukuna's experience and knowledge of the soul and energy was unparalleled, it allowed him to sense it immediately. The fractured nature of the nine-tailed spirit was unmistakable, a glaring imperfection in an otherwise overwhelming presence. The beast might have been hatred incarnate, but even it wasn't whole. And the boy didn't even know. He didn't understand the power within him, the potential to reshape the world, or destroy it. Naruto could have lashed out, could have unleashed the fox's rage upon the village that tormented him. Yet he didn't. Sukuna watched as the boy endured insult after insult, his head held high despite the tears that threatened to spill. "What a fool," Sukuna said, though he wasn't mocking the boy. "To seek their acceptance when you could crush them underfoot. The long for love when all they've given you is nothing but hate." He continued to observe as Naruto pulled pranks, his mischievous grin hiding the loneliness that ate away at him. The boy painted the Hokage monument, dyed the village fountains bright orange, and swapped signs on the market stalls, all for an inch of attention. Sukuna saw through it immediately. The pranks weren't about causing chaos, they were about being noticed, being acknowledged. He wanted someone to acknowledge his existence. Bad publicity was better than no publicity at all. The memories shifted again, showing Naruto sitting alone in his apartment after another failed exam. The boy stared at the cracked walls, his knees pulled to his chest as he hugged them tightly. He wasn't crying, not anymore. Sukuna could see the determination in his eyes, the fire that refused to be extinguished. "They'll notice me," Naruto whispered to himself, his voice trembling but resolute. "One day, they'll see I'm not a monster. I'll prove them wrong. I'll become Hokage, and then they'll have to respect me." Sukuna tilted his head, his expression unreadable as he watched the boy. There was a strange sense of familiarity in those words, a reflection of his own rise to power. He, too, had been scorned and feared in his time. He, too, had sought acknowledgement, not through love, but through domination. And yet, this boy chose a different path. "You're an idiot," Sukuna said, his voice tinged with amusement. "But maybe that's what makes you strong. You don't let their hatred consume you. You fight it, even if it breaks you." The King of Curses fell silent, his gaze lingering on the boy who had somehow endured a lifetime of suffering in just a few short years. As Sukuna sat there, reviewing everything he had learned from the boy's memories and about this strange new world, he couldn't help but feel something unexpected stirring within him. It was faint at first, like a whisper in the dark, but it grew louder the more he dwelled on the boy's life. He leaned forward slightly, crossing his forearms in thought, his crimson eyes narrowing as he tried to identify the unfamiliar sensation. It wasn't admiration, though there was something about Naruto's resilience that commanded a degree of respect. Nor was it disdain, though Sukuna often found himself scoffing at the boy's naive optimism. No, this was different, something he hadn't felt in centuries. Pity. The realization struck him like a blow, and for a moment, Sukuna sat frozen, his expression unreadable. Pity was not an emotion he was accustomed to. It was foreign, unwelcome, and yet undeniable. He hadn't felt anything like this since Uraum. Sukuna could still see it clearly, the boy sitting amidst the frozen corpses of his family and neighbors. The bodies were twisted in grotesque poses of agony, their faces contorted in fear. Yet the boy sat there, untouched by the frost, his small frame huddled in the center of the carnage. He wasn't crying, his eyes were dry and hollow, as if the horrors around him had drained him of all emotion. Sukuna had stumbled upon the scene, and questioned Uraum, but even he didn't understand what happened. And so the King of Curses had taken this strange boy with him, and things went from there. Sukuna had felt it then, this same gnawing sensation in his chest, this pity for someone so wretchedly alone and abandoned. He of all people, back then had shown compassion. Now, as he looked at Naruto, that same feeling had returned. Sukuna frowned, his forearms tightening across his chest as he leaned on one, his sharp mind grappling with the why. Why did this boy, this insignificant brat, evoke such a reaction? He thought of Naruto's memories, they played in his mind in a loop. The boy's suffering was undeniable, but so was his resilience. Sukuna had always despised weakness, yet he couldn't bring himself to hate the boy. And it wasn't just the boy's suffering that stood out, no, it was something deeper. The more Sukuna thought about it, the more he began to see the parallels between the boy and himself. Naruto was an unloved and unwanted child cast aside by the world. Sukuna knew what that was like. He, too, was an unloved, unwanted wretched brat no one cared for, born into a life of scorn and isolation. He too had been called a monster, shunned and scorned, cast out like trash to fend for himself. The memories of his own childhood rose unbidden, sharp and raw despite the centuries that had passed. Both of them had been rejected, ridiculed, and left to fend for themselves. Yet, their paths had diverged in the most profound way. Naruto, despite the hatred he carried within him, kept his bitterness buried deep within him, he refused to let it define him. He sought love, acceptance, and acknowledgement, desperately clinging to the hope that if he worked hard enough he'd be accepted like everyone else. He chose to endure the pain rather than inflict it on others. Sukuna, on the other hand, had chosen the opposite path. He had embraced his hatred, allowed it to consume him, and used it to carve his name into history. He had struck back at the world that had scorned him, carving a bloody path to the top out of spite and bitterness. His power had grown, but so had his loneliness. Even in his prime, surrounded by fear and reverence, Sukuna had been alone. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, as he looked at the unconscious boy. "You're nothing like me, brat," Sukuna said, his voice carrying a strange mix of bitterness and respect. "I burned the world for the way it treated me. You're trying to save it, even when it doesn't deserve it. Why didn't you lash out? Why didn't you crush them underfoot like the insects they are? You have the power, even if you don't know it yet. That fox inside you, it's more than enough to wipe this village off the map." The boy's memories revealed moments when Naruto had come close. Times when the darkness in his heart whispered temptations to strike back, to give in to the anger and pain. But Naruto had always stopped himself, always pulled back. Not because he lacked the will, but because he chose not to. Sukuna thought back to his own childhood, the jeers, the beatings, the endless nights of hunger and loneliness. Sukuna had risen above it all, not through kindness or hope, but through sheer, unrelenting hatred. His strength had been forged in the fires of vengeance, his name whispered in fear by those who had once scorned him. But even at the height of his power, surrounded by legions who worshipped him, Sukuna had felt the same emptiness he had known as a child. And now, here was this boy, this insignificant child who had every reason to lash out, to destroy, and yet, he didn't. Naruto's anger was there, simmering beneath the surface, but it didn't consume him. He sought connection, not destruction. He wanted to be loved, not feared. Naruto had something Sukuna hadn't, an indomitable will that defied all logic. Even in the face of rejection, even when it would have been easier to give up or strike back, the boy clung to the belief that things could get better. He pulled pranks not out of malice, but because he wanted to be seen, to be acknowledged. Publicity, no matter how negative, was better than being invisible. It baffled Sukuna, but he couldn't help but smile. This boy was interesting, different. You're either the biggest fool I've ever seen, or you're something else entirely. Either way, you're starting to amuse me, Naruto Uzumaki.